The sun has been up for less than 2 hours, but on the plain below Plataea, men have been dying for what feels like a lifetime. Spartan regent Pausanias stands at the right flank of the Greek line, and everything is going wrong. Not in the slow, grinding way that battles sometimes unravel, but catastrophically. The centre of the Greek alliance has dissolved into the darkness of the previous night, scattered across miles of open terrain by a botched withdrawal. Marching so far south, they have lost all contact with both wings. The Athenians on the left are pinned in brutal, grinding combat against Theban hoplites. Greeks fighting Greeks in the dust of a civil war within a war. And here, on the right, Pausanias and his Spartans stand alone. Completely alone. Facing the full weight of the surviving Persian land army under Mardonius himself, the finest soldiers the Achaemenid Empire could field, backed by thousands of cavalry, thousands of archers, and the burning fury of a king's general who has waited all winter for this moment. Persian arrows are not falling, they are pouring, wave after wave crashing into the locked Spartan shields like the tide crashing into a seawall, punching through bronze, finding gaps, finding flesh. Men are dying where they stand, they cannot advance, they cannot retreat, they can only hold and hold and hold. The heat is almost unbearable. Boeotia in August is not a pleasant place. The dust rising from 10,000 shuffling feet turns the air into something you chew rather than breathe. Sweat stings eyes behind helmets. The man to your left has already taken an arrow through his thigh and he hasn't made a sound. Because he is a Spartan, and Spartans do not make sounds. And Pausanias will not give the order to charge. Not yet. Because the sacrificial omens are still wrong. The priests have slaughtered animal after animal beside the battle line, and every single reading has come back unfavourable. By the ancient Greek understanding of warfare, this is not mere superstition. This is the will of the gods, and a Spartan regent does not charge into the heart of a Persian army when the gods say no, even as his men bleed, even as the arrows keep coming, even as Persian cavalry circles the flanks and the entire Greek campaign teeters on the edge of catastrophic collapse. He just stands there, shield raised, eyes forward, waiting. What you're watching right now is either an act of insane or reckless piety, or the most extraordinary feat of battlefield discipline in the ancient world. He is asking 5,000 Spartan warriors to absorb punishment and not respond, and they do it, because he asked them to. That moment, that single, agonizing, blood-soaked pause before the storm breaks, is what this entire story has been building toward. 800 miles travelled, 2 years of planning, the largest military force the ancient world had ever seen, the total destruction of Athens, the fall of Thermopylae, the bones of 300 Spartans left on a mountain pass. All of it has led to this plain, this dust, this man, this silence. Stay right here, because what comes next changes everything. The year is 481 BC, and the world has never seen anything like what is coming. Imagine an empire that stretches from the sunburned plains of Egypt all the way to the high mountain passes of India, from the scorched coastlines of Libya to the freezing rivers of Central Asia. An empire that rules, by some ancient accounts, over 50 million people. An empire with a navy drawn from the greatest maritime powers in the Mediterranean, Phoenicia, Cyprus, Egypt, and a land army so vast that, as Herodotus describes it, the rivers themselves are said to have run dry when it drank. This is the Achaemenid Persian Empire at the height of its power, the largest political entity the ancient world had ever produced, governed from the jewelled magnificence of Persepolis by a man who called himself King of Kings. His name is Xerxes I, son of Darius the Great, heir to the most powerful throne on earth, and he is absolutely furious. His father Darius had sent an army to crush Greece a decade before, and that army had been humiliated at Marathon in 490 BC. 10,000 Athenian hoplites stopping the might of the Persian Empire cold on a beach in Attica, sending it limping home across the Aegean. It was an insult that festered in the Persian court for years. Darius died before he could answer it. Xerxes inherited not just the throne, but the grudge, and Xerxes, unlike his father, was going to answer it personally. He spent 3 years, from 483 to 481 BC, in preparation on a scale that defies easy description. Supply depots carved into the landscape of Thrace, a canal dug through the entire peninsula of Mount Athos, so his fleet would never have to round that deadly headland again. 2 massive pontoon bridges constructed across the Hellespont, a mile-wide stretch of churning water between Asia and Europe, lashed together from hundreds of boats, with wooden planks and clay, and a road of earth laid across them, so that his army could march, literally, from one continent to another without getting their feet wet. Herodotus records that when a storm destroyed the first bridges, Xerxes ordered the Hellespont itself to be flogged, 300 lashes and chains cast into the water to symbolically bind the sea into submission. Honestly, when I read that passage for the first time, I genuinely stopped and put the book down for a moment. Because that tells you everything you need to know about the man. He was not just a king. He believed he was the axis around which the world turned. Now look at what he was marching against. Greece in 480 BC is not a nation. It is barely even a concept. It is a collection of fiercely independent city-states that have spent the better part of 2 centuries happily making war on each other. Athens and Sparta, the 2 most powerful, are natural rivals whose political systems are almost comically opposed. Athens is an experiment in radical democracy, its citizens voting on policy in the open assembly, governed by a genius named Themistocles, who had spent the last decade quietly preparing his city for exactly this moment. Sparta is a military oligarchy, a city-state that has essentially turned itself into a weapon. Every male citizen a professional soldier from the age of 7, shaped by one of the most brutal military conditioning programs in human history. Between them, Corinth, Thebes, Argos, and dozens of smaller polis, many of whom simply chose to submit to Persia rather than fight. The Greeks call those collaborators Medisers, men who chose the empire over Greece. And there were many of them. The Greek alliance that ultimately formed to resist Xerxes, the Hellenic League, represented perhaps 31 city-states out of hundreds. 31, against an empire of 50 million people and the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled. By any rational military calculus, this story should have ended quickly, quietly, and with total Persian victory. Greece should have become a satrapy, a Persian province, its culture extinguished, its democracy a brief, failed experiment, its gods replaced, its language absorbed. But something went wrong for Persia. Badly, irreversibly, catastrophically wrong. What you're about to watch unfold over the next 3 hours is not just a military story, though the battles are extraordinary enough to justify every minute. It is the story of how a handful of citizen soldiers, outnumbered at every turn, held together by sheer collective will and the terrifying tactical brilliance of a few remarkable men, dismantled the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever built. It is the story of Leonidas dying in a mountain pass so that Greece could live, of Themistocles constructing a deception so elegant it should be impossible, and watching it work perfectly, of an entire civilization choosing to burn its own capital city rather than surrender, of Pausanias standing still under a rain of arrows, waiting for the gods. This is how the Greeks annihilated the world's greatest invasion. To understand why 300 men chose to die in a mountain pass in central Greece, you first have to understand the world they were trying to save, and why that particular pass, on that particular stretch of coastline, was the only place in all of Greece where dying actually made strategic sense. The summer of 480 BC arrives with a kind of slow, suffocating dread. Xerxes has crossed the Hellespont. His army, a genuine river of humanity drawn from every corner of the Achaemenid Empire from the plains of Bactria to the banks of the Nile, is now moving south through Thrace and Macedonia. The ancient accounts give numbers that historians have spent centuries arguing over. Herodotus claims over 2 million fighting men, which modern scholarship considers a dramatic exaggeration. But even revised estimates place the Persian land force somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers. Whatever the precise figure, the Greek scouts who watched that army move along the northern roads came back describing something beyond their ability to fully communicate. A moving city, dust clouds visible from mountains miles away, a force so large that the rivers along its march route were said to have run dry. No Greek army had ever faced anything remotely like it. The psychological pressure alone, in the weeks before the armies even made contact, was enough to shatter alliances and break the will of entire city-states before a single spear was thrown. The Greek response to this approaching catastrophe was shaped at the Congress of Corinth, where delegates from the 31 allied city-states gathered to debate their options. The debate was not simple and it was not clean. Several Greek states had already capitulated to Persia. They had submitted, offered earth and water as the traditional tokens of surrender, and placed themselves under the empire's protection rather than face destruction. The Thessalians were wavering dangerously. The Thebans were barely concealing their willingness to collaborate with the invader, a decision that would have consequences for them at Plataea that the Theban leadership in 481 BC was not yet in a position to fully calculate. The Argives had already made it clear they would not fight under any circumstances, nursing old grievances against Sparta that they rated more urgently than the Persian threat. The alliance that finally formed was a coalition defined as much by desperation as by shared values, and it needed a strategy, fast, workable, and capable of holding together men who, under normal circumstances, could barely stand to be in the same room. It was Themistocles of Athens who shaped that strategy, and to understand his plan you need to understand what he had already been doing for the better part of a decade before the Persian army crossed the Hellespont. Back in 483 BC, a massive silver vein had been discovered at the mines of Laurion in southern Attica, one of the richest mineral strikes in Greek history, producing a windfall of public revenue that the standard political expectation would have distributed equally among the Athenian citizenry as a kind of dividend. Themistocles pushed back hard against that expectation. He went to the Athenian assembly and made a case that required his fellow citizens to accept short-term sacrifice for long-term survival, arguing that every last drachma of the Laurian silver should be invested in building warships. 170 new triremes, added to the Athenian fleet, transforming it into the largest and most powerful naval force in Greece. He told the people the fleet was for the ongoing war against Aegina, a nearby rival city-state with whom Athens had a genuine and active dispute. He was already thinking about Xerxes. He had been thinking about Xerxes for years. Personally, I find that political manoeuvre genuinely jaw-dropping every time I return to it. The man was playing a strategic chess game years ahead of anyone else at the board, while simultaneously convincing his own people they were only playing local politics. The scale of that foresight is staggering. The strategic plan Themistocles brought to the Congress of Corinth was elegant in the way that all truly brilliant strategies are elegant, obvious in retrospect, almost invisible to everyone else in prospect. Greece's geography runs north to south. Any army marching from the north must funnel through a series of natural bottlenecks where the mountain ranges press hard against the coastline. The largest and most defensible of these bottlenecks was a place the Greeks called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. At precisely the same time, any Persian fleet advancing south down the eastern coast of Greece would be forced to pass through the narrow straits near Cape Artemisium, on the northern tip of the island of Euboea, roughly 20 miles across the water from Thermopylae. The plan was to hold both points simultaneously, pin the Persian land advance at Thermopylae, while the Greek fleet engaged the Persian navy at Artemisium. The two battles would run in parallel, each one reinforcing the strategic viability of the other. If the land force held, the fleet could keep fighting, and the supply lines to the land force remained open. If the fleet at Artemisium held its position, the land force at Thermopylae could not be outflanked by sea. The entire strategy was a single interlocking system, and it lived or died on whether those two choke points could be held long enough for a broader Greek mobilization to take shape behind them. The man chosen to hold the land gate was the Spartan king Leonidas I. He was approximately 60 years old when he marched north, an age that in modern terms sounds elderly for a frontline combat commander, but in the context of Spartan military culture, represented something very different. A Spartan man of 60 who had survived the Agog and decades of military service was not diminished by age. He was the distilled product of a lifetime of physical and psychological conditioning that had been specifically designed to produce exactly this kind of soldier, a man for whom the concept of personal survival had been subordinated through decades of training and cultural pressure to the demands of duty and collective honour. Leonidas had not been raised from birth for the throne. He was a half-brother of the previous Spartan king Cleomenes, and had gone through the full Agog like any other Spartan boy, entering the military system at age 7, and emerging after 13 years of it, as a warrior rather than a prince. He was not primarily a political figure. He was a professional soldier who had arrived at kingship relatively late and wore the crown as a man wears equipment, because it was assigned to him and because the assignment required it. Herodotus tells us that when Leonidas chose the 300 Spartans who would accompany him north to Thermopylae, he selected only men who already had living sons. Read that carefully. He was not selecting his best 300 fighters, though they were certainly among the best available. He He was selecting men whose family lines would survive even if they did not, men who could be spent in the cold military accounting of the situation without extinguishing a Spartan bloodline. He already understood, on some level that he probably never articulated explicitly, but that shaped every decision he made from the moment the assignment was given, what this particular command might require of him and the men he brought north. The Delphic oracle had already issued its pronouncement in the clipped and devastating form the oracle favoured for communications of maximum consequence. Either Sparta would fall to the Persian advance, or a Spartan king would die defending it. Leonidas had made his peace with those terms before the first sandal hit the road north. The full Greek force at Thermopylae numbered somewhere around 7,000 men. This is a point worth establishing firmly because the legend of the 300, accurate as it is in its essentials, sometimes creates the misleading impression that the entire defence was conducted by a tiny elite force alone. Alongside the Spartan corps stood contingents from Corinth, Phocis, Locris, Thebes, Thespiae, Arcadia, and several other allied states. The 300 Spartans were the armoured iron fist at the centre of an allied force that was itself the door across the pass. But it was 300 Spartans at the sharpest point of the blade, backed by a further 500 Priochoi, the free non-citizen Spartans who served alongside the full Spartiates, plus the helot servants and support personnel who travelled with any Spartan military force of that size. Call it 1,000 Spartan-affiliated fighting men in total, embedded within a coalition of several thousand more. That coalition was what made the defence viable at the strategic level. The 300 were what made it legendary, now about the pass itself. Thermopylae translates directly as the Hot Gates, named for the sulphurous hot springs that still bubble from the ground there today, the same springs that were steaming in August of 480 BC, when Leonidas arrived to make his stand. The site sits on the eastern coast of central Greece, roughly 150 kilometres northwest of Athens, at the point where the Kalidromos mountain range presses down hard to the edge of the Malian Gulf. In 480 BC, before centuries of river silt from the Spercheios River extended the shoreline significantly, the cliffs came almost to the waterline. The navigable corridor between sheer rock face and open sea was, at its narrowest point near the middle gate, somewhere in the range of 15 to 20 metres wide. 15 to 20 metres. That is not a large fighting front. In practical terms, it meant that perhaps 15 to 20 shields could stand side by side across the full width of the usable passage. The Persian army of hundreds of thousands was going to have to feed itself through that corridor, one small unit at a time, attacking a shield wall it could not go round, could not flank from the seaside, and could not overwhelm simply by weight of numbers, because weight of numbers requires space to deploy, space the pass categorically refused to provide. This was the killing ground. Leonidas recognised it immediately upon surveying the terrain, and the recognition was almost certainly the point. Thermopylae had been identified as the key defensive position precisely because anyone with military experience and geographical knowledge could see what the pass did to the Persian numerical advantage. In a field engagement, Xerxes' army could envelop, outmaneuver, and simply crush any Greek force by simultaneous pressure on multiple fronts. In Thermopylae, the only front available was the one directly in front of the Greek shield wall. Leonidas also knew, before he arrived, that Thermopylae had a critical vulnerability, and he knew exactly where it was. There was a mountain track, a goat path that wound through the heights of the Kalidromos range, starting from the Asopus river gorge to the east of the pass, cutting through the oak forests and rocky ridges of the high ground, and emerging on the western side behind the Greek position. The path was called the Anapaea, and it was not a secret. The Phocians, whose territory included this region of Greece, knew it well, had known it for generations. In an earlier conflict, the Phocians had even built a defensive wall across the western approach to Thermopylae, specifically to guard against the Salian forces, using the Anapaea path to outflank them. Leonidas was aware of the track and aware of the danger it represented. He assigned a full 1,000 Phocian troops to guard it, a substantial force positioned on the high ground, with orders to hold the path against any Persian flanking column that tried to use it. The vulnerability was identified, covered, and addressed. The strategic position seemed, if not impregnable, then at least defensible for long enough to matter. What followed over the first 2 days of fighting at Thermopylae is something that military historians and tacticians have returned to repeatedly across 2.5 millennia, because the geometry of what happened is so starkly instructive. Xerxes had halted his army just north of the pass for 4 days before ordering any assault, a delay that Herodotus attributes partly to the expectation that the Greeks would simply recognise the hopelessness of their position and withdraw. They did not withdraw. On the 5th day, growing impatient and possibly beginning to feel the first pressure of his extended supply lines, Xerxes sent the Medes and Scythians forward. These were not second-rate troops. The Medes were veteran soldiers, experienced, aggressive, and fighting under the eyes of their king. They hit the Greek line at the middle gate, and the Greek line did not move. The Medes hit it again. It still did not move. They hit it a 3rd time, and began leaving their dead in heaps in front of shields that had not shifted an inch. Herodotus records that Xerxes, watching from an elevated throne constructed on the heights above the pass, physically rose from his seat 3 separate times during the fighting in agitation at what he was watching happen to his army. What the Medes, and then the Scythians, were encountering was the fundamental physics of hoplite combat in a confined killing ground. The Greek phalanx, that interlocked wall of great round aspis shields and thrusting 8-foot dory spears, standing 8 ranks deep, was nearly impossible to break in a frontal assault when it had no flanks to be turned. Each Spartan and allied hoplite stood behind a shield roughly 3 feet across, its left edge overlapping the right edge of the shield to his left, creating an interlocking barrier of bronze-faced wood that was not a collection of individual defensive positions but a single continuous wall. The spears of the front rank reached forward over the rim of that wall at chest and throat height. The spears of the second rank reached over the shoulders of the first. The pressure of the rear ranks drove the front ranks forward with the combined weight of 8 men pushing against every point of contact with the enemy. When a front rank man fell, and men did fall even in Thermopylae, the man immediately behind him stepped forward into the gap before the enemy could exploit it, the shields closing back together in a motion that had been drilled into every man in the formation since the age of 7. The Greek equipment was also simply superior for this kind of close-quarters fighting. The Greek thrusting spear was longer than the primary weapon Persian infantry carried. The Greek shield was larger, heavier, and more robustly constructed than the wicker and leather shields that formed the standard Persian infantry defence. The Greek bronze breastplate, greaves, and Corinthian helmet provided substantially better protection against the javelins, short spears, and slashing swords that Persian infantry used in close combat than the scale armour and linen corselets that equipped even the better Persian units. On open ground, with room to manoeuvre, with cavalry available to harass flanks and space to deploy missile troops at range, the Persians had multiple tactical options for neutralising these equipment disparities. In the hot gates, with cliff wall on one side and sea on the other, and barely enough lateral space to swing a sword, they had none of them. The Greeks also deployed a tactical rotation that showed a level of battlefield discipline that the Persian commanders, accustomed to fighting enemies who held or broke rather than systematically cycling their units, had no immediate answer for. Leonidas cycled fresh contingents through the fighting line at intervals throughout the day, Spartan units rotating back to rest while Corinthians or Tegeans held the wall, then rotating back in while those units recovered. The Persians, forced by the geometry of the pass to keep feeding troops forward from a column that stretched back miles without being able to deploy more than a fraction of their force at any given moment, grew increasingly ragged, demoralised, and physically exhausted as each fresh Greek unit replaced a tired one at the point of contact. On the second day, Xerxes sent forward his immortals, the 10,000 elite household troops of the Achaemenid king, hand-selected from across the empire for physical excellence and martial skill, distinguished by the golden pomegranates that decorated the butts of their spears, maintained at exactly 10,000 strength at all times through an immediate replacement system that gave them their name. Kill one, another instantly appears, the number never changes. They are immortal. These were the finest soldiers in the Persian army, the unit that represented Xerxes' personal military prestige, the force whose reputation preceded them through every land the empire had conquered. They advanced into the pass. The Spartans feigned retreat, a controlled, deliberate withdrawal that lured the immortals' vanguard forward into a disordered rush, breaking their formation in the excitement of what appeared to be a breaking enemy, and then the Spartans wheeled as a unit and cut them apart with the clinical, terrifying precision of men who had been practicing exactly this maneuver since childhood. The immortals withdrew, Even they could not break the wall. When Xerxes saw his immortals fall back from a line of Greeks that still had not moved, he reportedly rose from his throne a fourth time, this time, according to Herodotus, in pure fear. By the end of the second day, the Persian army had thrown its best available infantry, the Medes, the Scythians, the Immortals, at a pass held by a fraction of the Greek military capacity, and had failed on every attempt. Persian casualties over 2 days were severe enough that Xerxes later ordered his own dead buried specifically to prevent the Greeks from counting the bodies. A king who hides his casualties is a king who understands that the sight of them would be damaging to the confidence of his surviving troops. That calculation tells you more about the real cost of Thermopylae to the Persian advance than any body count Herodotus provides. Then, in the night of the second day, a man walked into the Persian camp. His name was Ephialtes of Trachis. He was a local man. Herodotus describes him as a Malian Greek who knew the landscape of the Kallidromus intimately. Whatever his precise background and whatever his specific motivations, Herodotus notes simply that he came seeking a reward, and Xerxes gave him one. What he brought to the Persian king was the one piece of information that could undo everything Leonidas had constructed. Ephialtes knew the Anapaea path. He knew it well enough to guide an army along it in darkness, through the oak forests and steep rock above the Asopus Gorge, emerging behind the Greek position by dawn. Xerxes accepted the offer immediately. The general chosen to lead the flanking march was Hydarnes, commander of the Immortals, the same force that had just been broken at the pass, given a chance to redeem the humiliation of the previous day by going around the wall that had stopped them from going through it. Hydarnes moved out that night with 10,000 men. Moving in darkness through difficult mountain terrain, guided by a traitor who knew every stone on the path, they marched through the night hours, the noise of their movement masked by the sounds of wind in the oak forest above the gorge. Somewhere on the high path, in the grey pre-dawn light, they encountered the Phocian guards Leonidas had posted. The Phocians heard the movement. Herodotus says the sound of rustling leaves betrayed the column's approach, grabbed their weapons, formed their line, and were immediately engulfed in a shower of Persian arrows. The arrow volley did not destroy the Phocian force, but it drove them back from the path onto the higher ground, where they attempted to regroup and defend the hilltops above the track rather than the track itself, and in doing so, critically, they left the Anapaea path open. Messengers ran down the mountain toward the Greek camp. By the time those messages arrived, it was almost dawn. There was a council. Herodotus tells us the Allied commanders were divided in their response to the news that a Persian flanking column was already behind them and would reach the western end of the pass by morning. Some argued for immediate withdrawal. The logic was straightforward and honest. To stay was to be encircled, cut off from retreat, and annihilated from 2 directions simultaneously. The survival of the allied Greek army required it to still exist when the decisive battles came, and a dead army helps no one. This argument was not cowardice. It was military realism. The allied contingents, Corinthians, Arcadians, Tegeans, most of the 7,000, were sent away. South, back toward Attica and the Peloponnese, back to fight at Salamis and Plataea and Mycale, back to do the things that ultimately won the war. What remained was a rearguard of approximately 1,400 men, the 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, from the small Boeotian city of Thespiae, who refused to leave and whose refusal was not irrational, because the Persians were about to destroy Thespiae, regardless of what happened at Thermopylae, and the Thespians had made a collective decision that death in battle was preferable to what was coming for their city anyway. And around 400 Thebans whose presence at the final stand remains one of the more complicated historical questions about the battle. Some ancient sources suggest they were held against their will as near hostages to prevent Theban defection, and indeed many of them reportedly surrendered to the Persians almost immediately when the end came, which suggests their commitment to the rearguard was something less than voluntary. But the Spartans and the Thespians stayed by choice. That much is not in dispute. Why? The question has echoed down through 2,500 years of military history, philosophy and literature, and the honest answer is probably layered rather than simple. The tactical explanation is real and should not be dismissed. A full Greek withdrawal from Thermopylae under Persian cavalry pressure from the rear would have been dangerously chaotic. Cavalry can run down retreating infantry on open ground and turn an organised withdrawal into a slaughter. Holding the pass for a few more hours gave the retreating Allied contingents time to get clear before the Persian flanking force closed the trap. In that strictly military sense, the rearguard was not a final stand. It was a necessary covering force. But I also think, and this is my honest reading of the sources and the context, that Leonidas understood something beyond the tactical. He understood that the story of what happened in the next few hours would be the story all of Greece would hear, that the alliance was held together partly by belief, the belief that resistance was possible, that the Persian advance could be met with something other than capitulation. And the story that belief needed was not about Greeks retreating. The oracle had spoken, the king had always known. He walked into it with open eyes. On the morning of the third day, Xerxes waited until the sun was well up before ordering the final assault. He wanted full daylight. He wanted the encirclement visible. He wanted the Greeks to understand with absolute clarity that the path behind them was closed and the path forward was his army. Persian forces advanced from the north in a dense mass. Commanders ordered to take prisoners if possible, with officers flogging their own men forward with whips when hesitation appeared at the front of the column. The Spartan rearguard advanced out of the pass to meet them, moving into the wider ground just north of the middle gate, where there was marginally more room to fight, and where a Spartan force fighting to inflict maximum casualties before dying would do more damage than a Spartan force backed against a wall. They were not defending the pass anymore. They were killing as many Persians as they could before the end came. Leonidas fell in the fighting. The precise moment is not recorded, but Herodotus is clear that he died in the thick of the melee, and that what followed was one of the most ferocious struggles of the entire battle. The Greeks and Persians fighting back and forth over the fallen king's body 4 separate times before the Spartans finally managed to drag the corpse clear of the fighting and hold it. Xerxes wanted the head. Every Persian soldier who could reach it was trying to claim it. The Spartans were not going to allow that. Men died, on both sides, specifically fighting over the body of a dead king, because symbols matter, and both sides knew it. Eventually the flanking column under Hydarnes came down from the Anapaea heights and struck the rearguard from behind. The remaining Spartans and Thespians pulled back to a small hill just behind the middle gate, a slight rise in the terrain, nothing that would qualify as a real defensive feature in any tactical manual, but the last elevated ground available to them. They formed a final circle on it. Spears broke. Men drew swords. When the swords broke or were lost, they fought with the butts of spear shafts. Herodotus says they fought with their bare hands and their teeth at the very end, when everything else was gone. Persian arrows ended it, Xerxes ordering a mass volley when his infantry could not break the circle by direct assault. The hill was covered in bodies. The pass was open. The road to Athens lay undefended. Simonides of Chios composed the epitaph that was placed at the site. In the original Greek it is 8 words of terrible compressed precision. The meaning runs roughly: Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. No monument, no boasting, no appeal to divine favour or legendary status. A statement of fact delivered to a stranger about obedient men who lay where they were told to lay. Xerxes, surveying the battlefield after the fighting ended, searched specifically for the body of Leonidas. When it was identified and brought to him, he ordered the king's head cut off and his body crucified. A treatment so contrary to normal Persian military conduct toward fallen enemies that ancient sources specifically note it as an expression of extraordinary personal fury. Leonidas had made Xerxes wait for 3 days, bleed for 3 days, and feel something in front of a Greek mountain pass that no personal force had made him feel in his entire life. The crucifixion of a dead man's body was the response of a king who could not process that experience through normal channels. The pass was open. The road to central Greece lay unguarded. Athens was 3 days away. But the delay had done precisely what it needed to do. The fleet at Artemisium had fought its battles and learned its lessons. The Greek land army had withdrawn intact to fight at Plataea. The Persian advance had been slowed, not stopped but slowed, at the cost that Leonidas had calculated and accepted before he left Sparta. 3 days. 3 days for which 300 men and 700 Thespians paid with everything they had. The story spread through Greece before the Persian army reached Athens. Not the story of military defeat. The pass had fallen and everyone knew it. The story of 300 men who chose to stand when they could have walked away. The story of a king who knew the prophecy and marched north anyway. The story of shields held until there were no men left behind them. That story did not save Thermopylae. It saved everything that came after it. While Leonidas was bleeding out the Persian army one wave at a time in the Hot Gates, 20 miles away across the open water of the Aegean, another battle was being fought simultaneously. A quieter battle, in the sense that history has been quieter about it, less famous, less mythologized, nowhere near as cinematically satisfying as 300 warriors dying in a mountain pass. But in terms of raw strategic consequence, the Battle of Artemisium may have been the most important thing that happened in the entire first phase of the Persian invasion. Because Artemisium was not just a naval engagement, it was the moment the Greeks learned, under genuine combat conditions, how to fight the most powerful fleet the ancient world had ever assembled, and survived long enough to use that knowledge at Salamis. To understand why the naval campaign mattered so much, you need to understand the relationship between Xerxes' army and his fleet. The Persian land force was simply too large to sustain itself entirely from the countryside it was marching through. Greece in 480 BC was not a rich agricultural landscape capable of feeding hundreds of thousands of soldiers indefinitely. It was a rocky, thin-soiled country where even the local population struggled to produce enough food in good years. Xerxes' army moved with a vast coastal supply fleet running parallel to the land advance, keeping it fed, equipped and operational as it pushed south. Without that fleet, the land army would begin to starve within weeks, not months. The Persian navy was not simply a fighting force, it was the circulatory system of the entire invasion. Cut the fleet, or sufficiently damage it, and the body of the Persian advance would begin to die of its own weight and hunger on the road. Themistocles had understood this fundamental strategic relationship since before the fleet was built, and it was the understanding that drove everything. The Laurian silver, the shipbuilding program, the plan presented at the Congress of Corinth, all of it. The Greek fleet that assembled at Artemisium in the late summer of 480 BC was, by any honest accounting, outmatched on paper. 271 triremes in total, officially commanded by the Spartan admiral Eurybiades, because the Spartans, consistent with their insistence on holding overall command of the Allied war effort, had demanded naval command despite having almost no ships of their own, but in practice guided, steered and energized by Themistocles of Athens, whose 127 Athenian triremes formed the largest single national contingent in the Allied fleet by a substantial margin. Alongside the Athenians came Corinthians with 40 ships, Megarians with 20, and smaller contingents from Aegina, Chalcis, Sicyon, Sparta itself, Epidaurus, Eretria, Troezen, Styra, and Chios. The fleet was a coalition in the true sense, assembled from many hands, answering to multiple commanders whose priorities did not always align, held together by the same combination of shared danger and political pressure that kept the land alliance from dissolving. Eurybiades was the formal commander, and Themistocles was the strategic engine, and for the plan to work, those two men had to function as a unit even when they disagreed, which they did, repeatedly, and which Themistocles managed with a combination of persuasion, flattery, bribery, and the quiet authority of a man who was simply more intelligent than everyone else in the room. Facing this allied fleet was a Persian armada that had left the harbour of Therma, modern Thessaloniki, with somewhere between 600 and 1,200 warships, depending on which ancient source you weight most heavily and how aggressively you apply modern historical skepticism to the numbers. The lower, more conservative modern estimates still place the Persian fleet at roughly 600 triremes and pentacontas at the start of the campaign, drawn from the maritime nations of the empire, the Phoenicians of the Levantine coast, who were the finest sailors in the ancient Mediterranean and provided the most capable and numerous contingent in Xerxes' fleet, the Egyptians, whose heavy, well-built ships were outstanding fighting platforms despite a reputation for being slower than the Phoenician vessels, the Cilicians of southern Anatolia, the Ionians, Greeks living under Persian rule along the western coast of Asia Minor, now serving in the fleet of the man marching against their ancestral homeland with feelings of varying complexity, the Carians, the Lycians, the Cypriots, and dozens of other maritime peoples absorbed into the empire over the preceding century. This was not a national fleet. It was an empire's worth of seamanship and shipbuilding concentrated into a single operational force, and in sheer numbers and accumulated naval experience, it dwarfed anything the Greeks had ever put to sea. The Persian fleet never arrived at Artemisium at full strength. What happened to it on the coast of Thessaly before the first Greek ram touched a Persian hull is one of the most dramatic episodes of the entire campaign. and it deserves more attention than it usually receives in the standard narrative of the Persian Wars. The fleet was moving south along the Thessalian coast after leaving Therma, keeping close to shore as large ancient fleets typically did to manage the logistical demands of feeding and watering thousands of oarsmen. It anchored along a stretch of coastline near Cape Sepias, a notoriously exposed and dangerous shoreline between the Magnesian Peninsula and the open Aegean, a place where shelter from storms was minimal and the sea bottom shelved steeply enough to make mooring unreliable. The fleet was too large to fit in the protected anchorages available. So many ships were moored in multiple rows along the open coast, the outer rows held in place by anchors and cables in water that offered no real protection from weather. This was already a precarious situation. Then the Hellespontine wind came in. Herodotus calls it a gale of extreme violence that lasted 3 full days. The wind came from the northeast, exactly the direction that drove the open sea directly onto the exposed Magnesian coast, with nothing to break it. As the gale intensified, the outer rows of ships began dragging anchors and driving onto the rocks. Ships in the second and third rows were driven into the ships inshore of them, creating cascading collisions as mooring cables snapped and hulls crushed against each other. The screaming of planking, the crack of oars being snapped off between hulls, the desperate shouts of oarsmen trying to push ships apart with poles while the sea drove them together, the noise alone must have been overwhelming. Persian ships from the outermost rows were shattered against the rocky coast or capsized in the surf. Herodotus claims 400 Persian warships were destroyed by the storm before the battle even began. Most modern historians treat that figure as an overestimate, possibly significantly so, but even the most conservative scholarly revision, 150 ships lost to weather, represents a catastrophic loss before the campaign's first naval engagement had taken place. Themistocles received the news of the storm's destruction with the controlled satisfaction of a man who has been dealt an unexpected card and immediately calculates how to play it. He did not allow it to make him complacent. The Persian fleet, even storm-reduced, still outnumbered the Greek allied force by a margin that made direct open water engagement a losing proposition, but the gap had closed. More importantly, something psychological had shifted in the Persian fleet that no storm damage assessment could fully quantify. The sailors who had survived those 3 days on the Magnesian coast, who had watched their ships destroyed not by an enemy but by the sea itself, on a campaign whose entire premise was invincibility, were shaken in a way that calm weather and restored numbers would not entirely repair. Confidence in a military force is partly arithmetic and partly atmosphere, and the atmosphere inside the Persian fleet after Cape Sepias was not what it had been when the armada left Therma. The situation on the Greek side was not without its own complications. When the Persian fleet, battered and reorganized, finally arrived at its anchorage at Aphytae on the Cape of Magnesia, directly across the channel from the Greek position at Artemisium, perhaps 8 to 10 miles of open water separating the two fleets, the sheer size of even the storm-damaged armada sent visible shock through the Greek Council of War. Eurybiades and several allied commanders wanted to withdraw southward immediately. The strategic case for retreat was not irrational. The Persian fleet was still enormously larger. The channel at Artemisium was wide enough to allow Persian, flanking maneuvers, and the survival of the Greek fleet, the instrument that Themistocles needed intact for the decisive engagement he was already planning at Salamis, was worth more than any symbolic stand at Artemisium. Retreat, reorganize, fight on better terms closer to home. The argument was coherent. Themistocles did not accept it. But he also did not simply overrule it, because he could not. Eurybiades held formal command, and the allied commanders had genuine authority over their own contingents. What he did instead was work every available lever simultaneously. He made the strategic argument. Artemisium was where the geography was best for the Greeks, where the channel constrained Persian numbers, where the land battle at Thermopylae depended on the fleet holding its position to prevent Persian ships from landing troops behind Leonidas's position on the Malian coast. He made the political argument. Athens had built more than half this fleet, and Athens needed the fleet to stay. Then he made the financial argument in the most direct possible terms. The Euboeans, whose island the Greek fleet was anchored off, whose cities and farms and livestock lay directly in the path of Persian advance if the fleet withdrew, came to Themistocles with 30 silver talents and asked him to make the alliance stay. Themistocles took the money. He gave 5 talents to Eurybiades, presented as a gift from his own resources, which induced the Spartan admiral to reconsider his position on withdrawal. He gave 3 talents to the Corinthian commander Adeimantus, who had been the loudest voice in favour of retreat. He distributed the remainder among other allied commanders, whose opposition dissolved with remarkable speed once the silver changed hands. The fleet stayed. Themistocles had spent the Euboeans' money to buy the battle the Euboeans needed him to fight. In another political context, this would be scandal. In the context of the Persian Wars, it was the most effective piece of coalition management in the campaign. The first engagement at Artemisium came in the late afternoon of the first day, and it came on Greek initiative. This is important. Themistocles did not wait to be attacked. He chose the moment and the terms. He wanted to hit the Persian fleet before it had fully reassembled after the Cape Sepias storm, and he wanted to do it under conditions, late afternoon, when the prevailing wind in the channel typically began to chop the sea and make precise Persian manoeuvring more difficult, that slightly reduced the Persian tactical advantages while the Greeks were fighting on ground they had chosen. The Greek triremes advanced in the defensive formation called the kouklos, a circle, with prows pointing outward toward the enemy and sterns pulled inward toward each other, so that no ship's vulnerable rear was exposed to a ramming attack. It was a formation designed to hold position and prevent encirclement, not to attack. Then, at Themistocles' signal, the circle exploded outward simultaneously, every Greek ship surging forward in every direction at once, trying to create individual dueling engagements at close quarters before the Persians could organize a coordinated response to the sudden expansion. It worked. 30 Persian warships were captured in that first engagement, their crews killed or taken prisoner, the hulls dragged back to the Greek anchorage. It was not a decisive victory in any quantitative sense. Against a fleet of several hundred ships, 30 captured vessels barely registered statistically. But the psychological and tactical significance was real. The Greeks had hit the Persian fleet, taken prizes, and returned without being destroyed. For oarsmen and marines who had been staring across 8 miles of water at the largest fleet they had ever seen, that proof of survivability was worth considerably more than the arithmetic suggested. Then, during that same night, a second storm hit. This one was not as catastrophic as Cape Sepias, but it was damaging, scattering ships at their anchorages, breaking moorings, killing men who had survived the day's fighting only to drown in the dark. And simultaneously, on the far side of Euboea, something happened that removed one of the greatest strategic threats the Persian fleet had posed to the entire Greek position. Xerxes had detached 200 of his warships from the main fleet and sent them on a wide flanking maneuver around the southern tip of the island of Euboea, through the strait the Greeks called the Hollows of Euboea, with orders to come up through the channel from the south and trap the Greek fleet between 2 converging Persian forces. It was a plan of real strategic elegance. If it had worked, the Greek fleet at Artemisium would have been caught between the main Persian armada to the north and a fresh Persian force to the south with no line of retreat. The entire allied naval force could have been destroyed at one stroke. The 200 ships sailed into the hollows of Euboea and sailed directly into the same storm that was hitting the main fleet at Aphatei. Every single one of them was wrecked. 200 warships destroyed, not by Greek seamanship, not by tactical brilliance, not by the courage of Greek marines, by the Aegean weather. The flanking force that could have ended the campaign at Artemisium was eliminated by the sea before it delivered a single blow. A Greek diver named Silius, who had been serving aboard Persian ships and who reportedly swam the entire channel between the fleets underwater to reach the Greek commanders, brought the news to Themistocles. The southern threat was gone. The Persian fleet was now smaller than it had been by several hundred ships. On the second day, the Greeks went after the Cilician contingent. The Cilicians, from the coastal regions of southern Anatolia, were among the less capable components of the Persian fleet, without the seamanship of the Phoenicians or the heavy ship advantages of the Egyptians. The Athenian squadron hit the Cilician line with focused, concentrated aggression, identifying its weakest point and driving into it before the rest of the Persian fleet could redirect to support. Ships were rammed, boarded, and destroyed. The Cilician contingent was broken apart and suffered severe casualties before the rest of the Persian armada could organize an effective response. Then the Greeks withdrew back to Artemisium before the response came. 2 days of fighting, and the Greeks had taken the initiative on both occasions. They had not won. They had not broken the Persian fleet or threatened its operational capacity in any fundamental way, but they had not been destroyed either, and every engagement was teaching Themistocles things about Persian naval tactics that he could not have learned any other way. I genuinely think about this aspect of Artemisium more than any other when I consider what Themistocles was doing during those 3 days. The Greeks were not traditional naval warriors. Athens had been building its fleet for less than a decade. The Phoenician sailors in the Persian armada had been driving triremes through the Mediterranean since before Athens was a proper city, with generations of accumulated seamanship and combat experience. And yet here was Themistocles, using 3 days of live combat against the best fleet in the ancient world as a research program, systematically identifying Persian tactical strengths and weaknesses under genuine battle conditions, refining his understanding of the specific circumstances under which the Greek fleet's advantages could be maximised and the Persian numerical superiority could be neutralised. Every afternoon engagement launched in the choppy late-day sea when Persian manoeuvring was harder. Every targeted attack against a specific weak component of the Persian line. Every deliberate withdrawal before the main Persian force could organise a comprehensive response. He was writing the tactical playbook for Salamis in the margins of the Artemisium engagements, and the Persians were paying for every page in ships and men. On the third day, Xerxes had seen enough of the cautious approach and ordered his fleet commanders to launch a full coordinated assault. The entire remaining Persian armada, organised, aggressive, the commanders presumably reminded of what happened to officers who displeased the King of Kings, advanced in a great crescent-shaped formation designed to envelop the Greek position, curl around both flanks simultaneously, and prevent any possibility of Greek withdrawal. The intention was to end the naval campaign at Artemisium in a single decisive engagement, destroying or capturing the entire allied Greek fleet in one afternoon and removing the naval threat to the Persian advance permanently. The Greek line did not retreat. It held position and met the Persian advance head-on. What followed was the hardest fighting of the 3 days, grinding, brutal, close-quarters naval combat that lasted through most of the afternoon. The channel between Artemisium and Plataea churned white by thousands of oar blades, the air above it thick with the sounds of rams striking hull timber, the screaming of oarsmen pinned between crushing ships, the clash of bronze weapons on the cramped fighting decks where Greek hoplites and Persian marines struggled to kill each other at point-blank range. Trireme warfare at close quarters was not the elegant nautical chess match that the strategic description suggests. It was loud, fast, terrifyingly intimate, and almost incomprehensibly violent. A trireme was 120 feet long and 18 feet wide, powered by 170 oarsmen sitting in 3 tiers, designed to accelerate to ramming speed and drive its bronze-sheathed bow through the hull of an enemy ship. When 2 triremes locked together, when the ram failed to disengage cleanly or when grappling hooks caught and held, the fighting deck became a battlefield, barely wider than a hallway, with fully armoured hoplites stabbing and pushing while the ship tilted and bucked beneath them. The Greeks suffered their heaviest casualties of the 3 days in the third day engagement. A number of ships were lost. Ancient sources give varying figures, but the losses were real and significant enough that Themistocles was aware, even as the fighting continued, that the fleet he was commanding would need time and reinforcement before it could fight another full engagement of this intensity. The Athenian contingent took particularly hard blows. Herodotus notes that half the Athenian ships were damaged to some degree before the day was over. But the Persian fleet also suffered. The crescent formation that had been designed to envelop the Greek line had found, in practice, that enveloping a fleet that refused to break was more difficult than it looked in the planning stage. The outer Persian ships trying to curl around the Greek flanks were exposing their own sides and sterns to Greek rams in the process, and Greek captains with the tactical presence of mind to exploit those exposures were doing so throughout the engagement. Then, as the third day's fighting was still grinding forward, news arrived from the land. A dispatch boat from Thermopylae, the pass had fallen, Leonidas was dead. The Anapeia path had been betrayed, the rearguard destroyed, and the Persian army was already moving south through the now open corridor toward Attica. The land battle, the other half of the strategic system Themistocles had designed, was over. The strategic purpose of holding Artemisium was gone. Eurybiades called the council immediately. The decision was made quickly because the only decision available was obvious. the fleet had to withdraw. To stay at Artemisium with the land position gone would be to hold a naval choke point that no longer served any strategic function, while risking the destruction of the only military instrument that stood between Persia and the permanent conquest of Greece. The fleet pulled back that night, moving south down the western coast of Euboea, then turning southwest toward the Saronic Gulf, towards Salamis. Before the fleet departed, Themistocles did something that reveals as much about his strategic intelligence as any battle he ever fought. He ordered his men to slaughter the cattle and livestock they found along the Euboean coast, eating what they could, burning the rest to deny it to the Persian advance. Then he had inscriptions carved into the rocks at the freshwater springs along the coast, addressed specifically to the Ionian Greek sailors serving in the Persian fleet. The message asked the Ionians to remember their kinship with mainland Greece, to defect if they could, to fight badly if they could not defect, and to spread word of these messages to any Ionians who had not seen them. He was planting seeds of doubt and division inside the Persian fleet's most capable, Greek-speaking component, using a rocky shoreline as a bulletin board. Whether any Ionian sailors ever actually read those inscriptions and changed their behaviour as a result is impossible to verify. What it tells you is that Themistocles was thinking about the psychological dimensions of the campaign at every level simultaneously, the tactical, the strategic and the political, while most commanders were focused on simply surviving the next, engagement. The withdrawal from Artemisium was not a defeat in the traditional military sense. The Greek fleet had not been broken or captured. It had fought 3 days of engagement against the largest naval force ever assembled, inflicted real and significant damage, taken and kept the initiative on 2 of the 3 days, and withdrawn with the core of its fighting capacity intact. It had also, as I have already suggested, accomplished something less tangible, but ultimately more important. It had educated Themistocles. 3 days of live combat against the Persian fleet had given him data that no amount of strategic planning or theoretical preparation could have provided. He knew now, from personal operational experience, precisely how the Persian fleet fought, its strengths, its weaknesses, its command structure's limitations, the tactical conditions under which its numerical advantage became a liability rather than an asset. He knew what a constrained channel did to Persian formation discipline. He knew how Persian captains responded to sudden flanking attacks. He knew the difference between the Phoenician contingent, which was genuinely excellent, and the Cilicians and Ionians, who were less so. And he knew that if he could choose the time and the place of the decisive engagement, if he could lure the Persian fleet into a narrow enough body of water at a moment of his choosing, in conditions that suited his ships and his tactics, he could win. He had already chosen the place. It was a narrow strait between an island and the Attic mainland, barely a mile wide at its tightest point, 3 miles from the ruins of Athens. The water there had a name that was about to become the most famous in the ancient world: Salamis. The fleet was already moving. The Persian navy, reorganized and replenished, was moving south behind it. Athens was burning ahead of them, and somewhere in the allied Greek council, the arguments about what to do next were already beginning. Arguments that Themistocles would have to manage with the same combination of brilliance, manipulation, and sheer force of will that had held Artemisium together for 3 days against a fleet twice its size. The next battle would not be 3 days of careful, probing engagements while Themistocles refined his understanding of the enemy. The next battle would be one morning, one narrow channel, one all-or-nothing moment in which the entire future of Greece would be decided before the sun reached its midpoint in the sky. That is why Artemisium belongs in the same breath as Thermopylae, even though it has never enjoyed the same legend. Thermopylae gave Greece time. Artemisium gave Greece knowledge. Time without knowledge would only delay defeat. Knowledge without time would arrive too late to matter. Together, the mountain pass and the sea channel created the conditions for Salamis. One taught the Greeks what Persian power could cost on land. The other taught them how Persian power could be trapped at sea, and that is the real hinge of the campaign. Not one miracle, but a chain of decisions, each one preserving enough strength for the next. And Themistocles was already planning every detail of it. Before we move into the darkest chapter of this story, I want to take 30 seconds to talk about something that genuinely matters to me personally, and that I think matters to you too, if you're the kind of person who watches 3-hour historical documentaries on the internet. We live in a world where your data, your browsing history, and your private information are being tracked, harvested, and sold every single day by companies you've never heard of. I use NORDVPN on every device I own, not because someone pays me to say that, but because it's simply the best tool I've found for keeping my connection private, my research secure, and my identity protected when I'm working online. Especially when I'm digging through academic databases and historical archives at odd hours of the night, which, if you've seen the research that goes into these scripts, you know happens constantly. If you want to support this channel and protect yourself at the same time, go grab NordVPN. The link is in the description. It genuinely helps keep this kind of content alive. Now, back to Athens, or rather, what was about to be left of it. There is a particular kind of grief that has no clean name, not the grief of a single death or even a battle lost. The grief of watching the place where everything you are was built, your home, your temples, your market square, the courtyard where your children played, the sacred hill where your gods lived, watching all of it knowing it is going to burn, and choosing to leave anyway. That is what Athens faced in the summer of 480 BC. And what the Athenians did in response to that certainty is one of the most extraordinary collective acts of rational courage in the entire ancient world. The strategic situation after Thermopylae was unambiguous. The Persian army was through the pass and moving south. The allied Greek land force, the rearguard of a coalition that had planned to hold central Greece at the Hot Gates, was in full retreat toward the Isthmus of Corinth, the narrow neck of land that connects the Peloponnese to the rest of Greece, and the only viable defensive line remaining for the Spartan-led Peloponnesian states. Central Greece was effectively abandoned. Boeotia was already falling into Persian hands. Thebes, its largest city, had been sitting on the fence between resistance and collaboration all summer, and now it folded entirely, choosing to cooperate with Xerxes and provide his army with supplies and local intelligence. Attica, the territory around Athens, lay directly in the path of the Persian advance with no land force left to defend it. Athens had actually begun preparing for this moment months earlier. The critical document in this story is the Themistocles decree, preserved in a controversial inscription discovered at Troezen in the Peloponnese in 1959, whose authenticity has been debated by scholars ever since, though its broad outline matches what Herodotus describes. The decree, proposed by Themistocles before the campaign season even opened, laid out the evacuation in stark, practical terms. Women and children to be sent to Troezen, a city in the northeastern Peloponnese. The elderly and movable property to Salamis, the island just off the Attic coast. Every Athenian man of fighting age to board a ship. All 200 ships. The entire fleet. Every able-bodied male citizen of Athens was to become a sailor or a marine, leaving behind the physical city, the houses, the workshops, the farms, the temples and the bones of the ancestors, and trusting that the sea would save what stone could not. This was not a unanimous or comfortable decision. It required, first and foremost, an act of extraordinary intellectual courage from Themistocles himself, the willingness to reinterpret the Delphic oracle in a way that most Athenians would have found deeply counterintuitive. When Athens had sent to Delphi for guidance in the face of the Persian threat, the oracle had responded with one of its characteristically ambiguous pronouncements. The first response was catastrophic. It described destruction, fire, and ruin for Athens. The Athenian delegation refused to accept this and pressed again. The second response mentioned wooden walls, that only the wooden wall would protect the Athenians, that divine Salamis would bring death to the sons of women. Many Athenians interpreted this literally. Build wooden walls around the Acropolis, barricade the sacred hill, stand and fight. The wooden wall would protect them. Themistocles stood before the Athenian assembly and said they were all reading it wrong. The wooden walls were the ships. The fleet was the divine protection the oracle promised. And the phrase about Salamis bringing death. Notice, he argued, that the oracle calls Salamis holy, not cruel. Holy Salamis would bring death to the sons of Persian women, not Greek ones. He was reworking the oracle in real time, before a democratic assembly of 10,000 men, under existential pressure, and making it stick. The assembly voted to follow his interpretation, to leave, to trust the ships. What that decision looked like on the ground is something the ancient sources touch on only briefly, but what they describe is haunting. This was not a decision made by generals behind closed doors. It was placed before the democratic assembly itself. Thousands of Athenian citizens forced to vote on whether their city was its stone walls or its living people. The sacred snake of Athena, whose untouched food was treated as a sign that the goddess had already left the Acropolis, gave religious cover to what Themistocles was asking them to do. The city, in other words, was being told by strategy and by heaven at once. Leave the stones, save the people, trust the wooden walls. The evacuation of Athens was chaotic, emotionally devastating, and logistically enormous. The entire civilian population of Attica, tens of thousands of people, had to be moved across water or over roads to Troezen, Aegina, and Salamis within a matter of weeks. Herodotus tells us that people wept in the streets, that families buried their most precious possessions in the earth beneath their homes hoping to return for them, that old men who refused to leave sat down in the empty agora surrounded by their belongings and simply would not move. Some accounts describe dogs running alongside the boats carrying their owners across to Salamis, howling at the water, including, in one of the strangest specific details in Herodotus, the dog of the statesman Xanthippus, which reportedly swam the channel to Salamis following its master's ship and died of exhaustion on the beach. The priests and priestesses of the Acropolis, the guardians of Athena's sacred precincts atop the great rock that dominated the city, were among the last to leave. Their duty was to protect the goddess's treasures, her cult statue, her sacred olive tree, the ancient relics that made the Acropolis not just a hill, but the living heart of Athenian religious identity. Some of them interpreted the wooden wall oracle exactly as the literalists had. They built a palisade of wood around the Acropolis gate, laid in stores of food and water, and prepared to withstand a siege. Perhaps a few dozen men and women, on a rock above an empty city, waiting behind a wooden fence for the largest army in the world. Athens itself, the lower city, the agora, the workshops of the potters and bronze smiths, the houses climbing the lower slopes of the hills, the gymnasium, the stoas, the law courts where Athenian democracy had debated and decided for generations, stood nearly empty. A ghost city, a few stray animals, the echo of footsteps in abandoned streets, the smell of the sea in the silence. Then, sometime in September of 480 BC, the dust cloud appeared on the northern horizon. Xerxes entered Attica. His army poured through the passes of the Scythian range and spread across the plain below, moving south and east toward the city. Herodotus describes the approach as visible for miles, the dust of hundreds of thousands of feet and hooves rising like a storm front over the plain of Attica, the sun catching the bronze and gilding of Persian equipment, the noise building from a distant rumble to something you felt in your chest before you could properly hear it. Whatever Athenians were still in the city, those who had refused to leave, those too old or too infirm to move, must have watched that approach from the Acropolis heights with a terror that has no adequate modern equivalent. The Persian vanguard reached Athens and found it almost deserted. This was not what conquest was supposed to look like. There was no last desperate stand of the city's defenders, no panicked crowds to be enslaved, no resistance at the city gates, just emptiness. Abandoned houses with doors still open, a city that had, in essence, already escaped. Xerxes had marched 2,000 miles and assembled the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen, and the people he had come to punish had simply left. That detail, I think, must have been profoundly unsatisfying to a man of Xerxes' temperament. The conquest of an empty city is not a conquest. It is walking into a house where everyone has already gone out through the back door. The Acropolis was another matter. The holdouts behind the wooden palisade, the priests, the elderly volunteers, the diehards who had taken the oracle at its most literal, refused to surrender. Xerxes sent emissaries up the sacred hill. He even sent, according to Herodotus, exiled Athenian nobles from his retinue, men who had fled Athens years earlier and were now serving in the Persian court, to climb the Acropolis and speak to the defenders in their own language, urging them to come down, to submit, to be spared. The defenders refused. They rolled boulders down the path to stop the Persian approach. They hurled roof tiles and stones when Persian soldiers tried to scale the walls. For a time, it held. The approach to the Acropolis rock is steep and difficult on every side, and the single main path could be blocked and defended by a small force. Persian arrows lofted upward mostly clattered off stone. The wooden palisade at the gate held against initial attempts to breach it, but the Persians found a way. A small group of soldiers discovered a route up the sheer north face of the rock. a place the defenders had not bothered to guard because the cliff there was so steep it had seemed unscalable. It was not unscalable. It was merely very difficult. The Persians climbed it. When the defenders on the Acropolis saw Persian soldiers appearing over the edge of the cliff behind them, some threw themselves from the heights rather than be taken. Others fled into the temple itself, barricading the great doors. The Persian soldiers broke through. What followed inside the sanctuary was, by every ancient account, total destruction. The older Parthenon, the great predecessor to the famous building Pericles would later construct on its foundations, was burned. The temple of Athena Polias was burned. The sacred olive tree, said to have been planted by Athena herself, was burned. The accumulated votive offerings, the statues, the dedications of generations of Athenian piety, looted, smashed, or consumed by fire. Xerxes stood somewhere below and watched the smoke rising from the rock of Athens, and then, according to Herodotus, he sent a message to Susa, to the Persian court, announcing that he had burned Athens. He sent that message too early. The physical destruction of the Acropolis was, by the logic of ancient warfare, an entirely standard act of conquest. Victorious armies burned the sacred places of their enemies. It was theological as much as military, a demonstration that the gods of the conquered had failed, that the gods of the conqueror were stronger, that the divine order now favoured the empire. Xerxes was not being uniquely savage. He was following the script that empires had always followed. But the act carried within it a miscalculation that he could not see clearly from the hill of the Acropolis, because for the Athenians watching the smoke from the decks of their triremes off Salamis, and they could see it, the smoke was visible across the water, the burning of Athens did not break their will. It ignited it. Something shifted in the Greek alliance in the days after Athens burned. The argument that had been splitting the allied commanders at every naval council, whether to retreat to the isthmus, whether to preserve the fleet for the defence of the Peloponnese, whether to abandon the Athenians entirely to their fate and let Xerxes have everything north of Corinth, that argument now met a different emotional reality. Athens had already given up its city, already given up its homes, its temples, its graves. It had evacuated its entire civilian population across open water and put every fighting man on a ship. It had made the sacrifice that was being asked of it in full, without conditions. And now those 127 Athenian triremes were sitting off Salamis, their crews watching their city burn, and Themistocles was telling the allied commanders that the fleet had to stay and fight in those exact waters. The moral weight of Athens having already lost everything was not nothing. There is a psychological mechanism in collective situations of extremity. When one party has already given their absolute maximum, the pressure on others to match that sacrifice becomes almost unbearable. Themistocles, that relentless political calculator, understood this perfectly. The burning of Athens was not, for him, only a tragedy. It was the most powerful argument he would ever have. He used it. The Athenian civilians, meanwhile, were scattered across the waters and shores of the Saronic Gulf. Families crammed into the city of Troezen, which had received them with remarkable generosity, providing housing and a daily stipend of 2 obols per refugee. Children were billeted in private homes. Schools were thrown open. The Troezenians, an otherwise historically obscure people, did something in the summer of 480 BC that deserves far more credit than it usually receives. They absorbed the entire civilian population of Athens and kept them fed and safe, while their city burned and their fathers and husbands prepared for the most important naval battle in history. The quiet heroism of this moment is easy to miss because no army is charging and no fleet is yet moving. Troezen, Aegina, and Salamis became temporary Athens. Houses that had belonged to ordinary families suddenly held strangers from Attica. Courtyards became sleeping space. Storehouses became emergency shelters. Children who had left behind toys, tutors, and familiar streets had to learn the names of new hosts in cities that were not their own. Women who had buried family silver beneath floors they might never see again now had to keep households functioning in exile, while the men prepared to row into battle. The evacuation was not just a strategic maneuver, it was the conversion of an entire people into a refugee nation, without allowing that nation to lose its political identity. That last point is critical. The Athenians did not dissolve into frightened individuals the moment the city burned. They carried the city with them in law, memory, assembly, priesthood, fleet, and family. Their democracy did not stop because the meeting place was abandoned. Their gods did not vanish because the temples were burning. Their claim to exist as Athens moved with the people who had voted to leave, the crews who rowed the triremes, and the civilians who waited behind them on the islands. This is why Xerxes misunderstood the conquest so badly. He captured the location of Athens. Themistocles had already moved Athens into the water. On Salamis itself, the situation was raw and immediate. Refugees packed the island. Families looked north across the narrow channel at the smoke rising from the Attic hills. Old men who had seen the city of their birth stood on the shore and watched the sky above it turn black. Children asked questions that no one could answer honestly. When are we going home? What happened to our house? Will the gods be angry that the temple burned? What happened to our house? The answer, for most of them, was gone. The Persian army, having taken the Acropolis and satisfied the requirement of symbolic vengeance, proceeded to do what armies do in occupied territory. They spread out across Attica. Farmsteads burned, villages burned, orchards were cut for firewood or simply destroyed. The silver mines at Laurion, whose output had built the fleet now sitting off Salamis, were occupied. The countryside that had fed Athens for generations became a Persian supply depot and a demonstration of what submission looked like from the losing side. But the city's soul was not in the buildings. The Athenians, Herodotus makes this plain in a passage that is easy to miss if you're reading quickly, had already made their peace with the physical destruction before it happened. The decision to evacuate, the vote in the assembly, the interpretation of the oracle, all of it had been a collective agreement to place survival of the people above survival of the place. Athens was its citizens, not its stones. The stones could be rebuilt, the people could not be replaced, and the fleet, the 127 wooden triremes sitting in the strait off Salamis, those were the wooden walls of Athens now. Those were the city. Those oarsmen rowing in shifts. Those marines sharpening their spears on the decks. Those tired, grieving, furious men. They were everything that Athens was and everything it would become. Xerxes had burned a city. He had not broken a civilization. And in the narrow waters of Salamis, just 3 miles from where his soldiers were now occupying the ash-covered ruins of the Acropolis, the civilization was about to prove that to him in the most direct possible way. He made his headquarters at Phalerum, the bay south of Athens where his fleet had anchored after advancing from Artemisium. Around him, the most powerful military machine ever assembled was in good shape. The land army largely intact, the fleet reduced but still enormous, the supply lines running, the enemy apparently cornered on an island. From the Persian perspective, the campaign was going exactly as it was supposed to go. Athens had fallen. The Acropolis was ash. The Greek alliance was fractured, arguing, barely holding together. A few more weeks of pressure and the war would be over. He convened his council at Phalerum. Around him, the commanders of every naval contingent in the empire, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Ionians, Cilicians, Carians, gathered to advise their king on the final blow. And in the back of that council, watching the faces of the men who would have to fight the battle, Xerxes was planning, sat Artemisia of Halicarnassus, queen, naval commander, the only woman in the room, and the only person in it willing to say clearly what the strategic reality actually demanded. She told him the truth. She told him what a clear-eyed reading of the situation would tell any commander not blinded by the momentum of conquest. The Greeks were cornered, yes, but cornered was not the same as defeated. The Greek fleet at Salamis had fought 3 days at Artemisium without collapsing. A direct naval assault in confined waters, precisely the waters the Greeks had chosen to defend, was risky. There was no need to risk it. March the army toward the Peloponnese, pressure Sparta. The alliance would fracture on its own. The Athenians, with their city gone and their people scattered, would have nothing left to fight for. Time and hunger would accomplish what a naval battle might not. She was right. She was completely, strategically right, and Xerxes did not listen. The invitation of an apparently decisive naval victory was too powerful. The fleet was assembled. The enemy was cornered. The throne had been constructed on the hillside overlooking the strait, so that the King of Kings could watch his final triumph in person. Everything was in place. You do not build a throne on a hillside to watch yourself take cautious, patient advice. The decision was made. The fleet would advance into the strait. Someone had made sure of it, and that someone was sitting on a Greek trireme off Salamis, watching the Persian fires across the water, smiling the way a man smiles when a plan he has been building for 3 years is finally about to pay off. His name, by now, needs no introduction. The night before the Battle of Salamis, Themistocles needed that desperation carefully managed. Too much of it, channeled wrong, could dissolve the alliance. The allied Greek commanders anchored at Salamis were already in a state of barely controlled political crisis before the Persian army reached Athens. The Peloponnesian commanders, the Corinthians, the Spartans, the contingents from the southern Greek states, wanted to leave. They had wanted to leave since before Artemisium, and the fall of Thermopylae and the burning of Athens gave their argument a renewed urgency that was difficult to counter on purely logical grounds. Their reasoning was not irrational. The Persian army had broken through the land defences, had occupied Athens and was now pressing southward toward the Isthmus of Corinth, where Spartan engineers were building the last land barrier before the Peloponnese itself. The Peloponnesian commanders felt, with some justification, that their place was south of that wall, not anchored off a burning island fighting a naval battle whose outcome was uncertain. Retreat to the Isthmus. Fight in open water near home. If the battle went wrong, the fleet could still withdraw behind land defences. Themistocles had heard this argument at every stage of the campaign, and he was done negotiating with it. He understood, with a clarity that the Peloponnesian commanders either lacked or chose not to acknowledge, that the wall at the Isthmus of Corinth was militarily irrelevant if the Persian fleet retained operational freedom in the Aegean. A wall across the isthmus stops a land army. It does nothing about a fleet that can sail around it, land troops anywhere on the Peloponnesian coast, and simply bypass the barrier entirely. The only thing protecting the Peloponnese from that possibility was the Greek fleet, and the Greek fleet was most effective not in open water near the isthmus, where Persian numbers could be fully deployed, but here, in the narrow strait at Salamis, where those numbers became a liability. He made this argument in the Allied Council with increasing bluntness. Athens had already done more than any other Greek state. It had abandoned its city, evacuated its people, and put every able-bodied man to sea. 127 Athenian triremes were sitting in this strait right now, representing more than half the entire Allied fleet. Without those ships, there was no Greek navy. Without a Greek navy, the wall at the isthmus was a line drawn in sand, and if the council voted to abandon Salamis and sail south, Athens would take its fleet and leave Greece entirely, sail for southern Italy, found a new colony, and let the Peloponnesians face Xerxes without the city that had built the fleet that had made resistance possible in the first place. He meant every word of it, and every man in that council tent knew he meant it. The retreat was voted down. But Themistocles also knew something he could not say in the council. The decision might not hold. Nervous commanders watching Persian warships fill the horizon the next morning might simply leave anyway, in the night, citing fear or independent judgment or orders from home. The Allied line at Salamis would dissolve before a Persian ram ever touched it. He needed the battle to happen now, tonight, at his choosing, before the alliance had time to refracture in the dark. So he did something that was either the most audacious act of strategic deception in the ancient world, or the most reckless gamble ever taken by a man who happened to be right. He sent a message to Xerxes. The messenger was a trusted slave named Sisinus, a man who served as tutor to Themistocles' children and who spoke Persian. Themistocles dictated a message and sent Sisinus across the water to the Persian fleet in the night, with instructions to deliver it to the Persian officers and return. The message claimed to come from a Greek commander sympathetic to the Persian cause, someone willing to betray the alliance to its enemies. It told Xerxes that the Greek fleet was on the verge of collapse, that the Peloponnesian contingents were planning to slip away during the night, that if Xerxes sealed both exits of the Salamis Strait immediately, blocking the northern passage near Eleusis and the southern channel with his Aeginetan-facing squadrons, he could trap every remaining Greek ship in the strait and destroy the entire Allied navy in a single engagement before dawn. Every word of it was false, constructed with surgical precision to tell Xerxes exactly what Xerxes already wanted to believe. Because this is the thing about Xerxes at this point in the campaign. Everything he had seen since crossing the Hellespont had reinforced a single narrative: that Greece was breaking, that resistance was fragmenting, that the Greek alliance was held together only by fear, and would dissolve the moment real pressure was applied. Marathon had been an anomaly, a local failure, a result of mismanagement rather than genuine Greek capability. Now he had broken Thermopylae. He had occupied Athens. He had watched the Greek fleet retreat from Artemisium. The pattern was clear. He was winning. The Greeks were cracking. A message confirming that pattern, arriving at the right moment, from someone claiming to be a Greek collaborator. It fit the story Xerxes was already telling himself about the campaign. The message did not have to be convincing. It had to be consistent with an existing belief. Themistocles had read Xerxes accurately enough to know the difference. Xerxes ordered the Persian fleet to move. During the night, Egyptian squadrons were dispatched to block the western channel around Salamis near Eleusis, cutting off the northern escape route. The main Persian fleet began positioning itself at the southern entrance to the strait, ready to advance at dawn. The trap was set, except that it was Themistocles who had set it, not Xerxes, and the fleet trapped inside the strait was not the fragmented, retreating Greek force the Persian king believed he was about to destroy. It was exactly the fleet and exactly the battle formation that Themistocles had designed for precisely this channel, on precisely this morning. The night before, Salamis was not quiet on the Greek side. Themistocles had achieved what he needed. The battle was now going to happen whether the Peloponnesian commanders wanted it or not, because Persian warships were blocking both exits. There was nowhere to retreat to. The Allied fleet would fight at Salamis in the morning because the Persian fleet was already surrounding it, and the responsibility for that situation rested entirely with Themistocles, and he was completely at peace with that. The Athenian exile Aristides, a man who had been Themistocles' political rival for years, ostracized from Athens by a vote of the assembly in which Themistocles had played no small part, arrived by boat during the night with news that confirmed what Themistocles had engineered. The Egyptian squadron had indeed closed the western channel. The Greek fleet was encircled. Aristides, his exile rendered irrelevant by the scale of the crisis, delivered his intelligence report and offered his services. Themistocles told him what he had done. Aristides went into the Allied Council and confirmed the situation from an independent source, a testimony that finally, definitively, silenced the retreat argument, because retreating was no longer physically possible. The fleet prepared for battle in the pre-dawn dark. Oarsmen took their places on the rowing benches. 3 tiers of them, 170 men per ship, thighs pressed against the man ahead, oars threaded through the oar ports, the smell of bilge water and sweat and the salt of the strait in the confined spaces below the fighting deck. Marines in full bronze armour found their positions on the narrow fighting decks above. Captains reviewed what they knew about the channel, the shallow sections that could ground a trireme, the currents that would affect steering, the precise locations where the channel narrowed to its minimum width, and where the Persian numerical advantage would be most effectively cancelled. Priests performed the morning sacrifices. The omens were read. The gods were addressed. Across the water, in the pre-dawn dark on the Persian side, Xerxes had himself carried on a golden throne to a promontory above the strait, where he could watch the battle unfold below him. He had brought secretaries to record the names of his commanders who distinguished themselves. He expected to watch the destruction of the Greek fleet and the end of the naval campaign before breakfast. He was surrounded by Persian nobles and officers, all of them watching the same dark water, all of them expecting the same outcome. The sun came up over the mountains behind Athens, the light reached the strait, and the Greek fleet came out. What the Persian fleet saw, advancing toward them out of the shadow of the Salamis shore, was not the fractured, retreating collection of frightened city-state contingents they had been told to expect. It was a line, a disciplined, organised, coherent line of Greek triremes moving in formation across the narrowest part of the channel, prows forward, oars pulling in measured stroke, the bronze rams just below the waterline catching the early light. It was not what Xerxes had been promised by the message Sisinus had delivered the night before. The Greek fleet was not dissolving. It was not retreating. It was advancing, and it was advancing into a space that was about to do something devastating to the Persian fleet's ability to use its numbers. To understand what happened at Salamis on that September morning in 480 BC, you need to understand the geometry of the battle before the first ram struck the first hull. The strait between the island of Salamis and the Attic mainland runs roughly east to west, narrowing at its tightest point to approximately 1 mile of navigable water. 1 mile sounds wide until you consider what was being asked to fit inside it. The Persian fleet, even after the losses at Cape Sepias and Artemisium and the flanking force destroyed in the hollows of Euboea, still numbered somewhere between 300 and 500 operational warships. Deploying that many triremes in a single battle line requires an enormous amount of lateral space. A trireme is 18 feet wide. A battle line needs spacing between ships to allow the oars to operate without fouling the oars of the adjacent vessel. Basic mathematics tells you that a fleet of 400 ships, properly spaced for combat maneuvering, needs miles of open water to deploy effectively. In a channel 1 mile wide, that fleet cannot deploy properly. It can only push forward in depth, ships lined up behind other ships, the rear ranks unable to engage because the front ranks are blocking the channel, the flanking capability that makes large fleets decisive in open water simply unavailable because there are no flanks to use. The Persian fleet at Salamis was like an army trying to fight a battle in a corridor. Its numbers were not an advantage in that channel. They were a problem. Themistocles had chosen this ground for exactly that reason. He had watched what happened to Persian tactical organisation in the confined waters off Artemisium, how the crescent formation that worked beautifully in open water became awkward and slow to coordinate when the channel narrowed and ships began interfering with each other's movement. He had watched how the late afternoon chop affected Persian rowing precision more than Greek, because Persian captains tried to maintain complex formations in deteriorating conditions, while Greek captains used the confusion to pick individual targets. He had spent 3 days at Artemisium calibrating his understanding of precisely what the Persian fleet could and could not do, and Salamis was the application of everything that calibration had taught him. The Greek line advanced in 2 sections. The Athenians held the left wing, positioned opposite the Phoenician contingent, the best sailors in the Persian fleet, the most capable and dangerous component of the armada, given to the most capable and aggressive Greek contingent as a deliberate match of strength against strength. The Spartan commanded right wing, backed by the Peloponnesian contingents, held the position opposite the Ionian Greeks serving in the Persian fleet, contingents whose loyalty Themistocles had been actively undermining since Artemisium with his carved rock inscriptions, and whose reliability under pressure he assessed as considerably less than the Phoenicians. The positioning was not accidental. Every element of the Greek battle formation had been chosen to maximize specific advantages at specific points along the line. The Persian fleet advanced into the strait in the early morning. It came in multiple columns, pushing forward through the channel entrance from the south and east, the ships beginning to bunch and press as the channel walls closed around them, and the depth of the Persian formation became a navigational problem rather than a tactical asset. Persian captains who had been drilled in open water formation fighting, the sweeping flanking manoeuvres, the diekplus where a ship rows through a gap in the enemy line and then turns to ram the exposed oar banks of the ships it has just passed, the periplus where squadrons curl around the enemy's flank and strike from the rear, found themselves in a space where none of those manoeuvres were possible. The channel was too narrow for the diekplus because there were no gaps to row through. The Greek line was closed and steady. It was too narrow for the periplus because there were no flanks to curl around. The Greek line stretched from shore to shore across the full width of the navigable water. The Persians could only push forward, and as they pushed forward, the ships behind them pushed into the ships in front, the formation beginning to compress and disorder itself before the Greeks had rammed a single hull. The Greek line waited. This is the part of the story that I find psychologically extraordinary every time I return to it. The discipline required to hold a trireme battle line stationary, while a vastly larger fleet is rowing toward you across diminishing water. Every instinct of self-preservation is pulling at the oarsmen on those benches. Every calculation of odds is unfavourable, and the order is to hold position and wait for the moment Themistocles had chosen. They held. The Persian advance came closer. The gap between the fleets narrowed to a few hundred meters, a few hundred feet. Then the Greek line surged forward. The first ram strikes are described by ancient sources with an almost musical metaphor, a great crash, like the sound of bronze bells, rolling down the length of the strait as Greek prows drove into Persian hulls simultaneously along the full width of the battle line. Ships that had been rowing forward under full oar power had that power suddenly arrested by the impact of a ram punching through their hull planking. The momentum of the vessel transferred instantly into structural damage. Oarsmen thrown from their benches by the collision the ship beginning to take water through the ram hole before the Greek trireme could back off and disengage. The Greek tactic was to ram, back water immediately to extract the ram before the two ships locked together, and row forward to find the next target, keeping the Greek ships mobile while the Persian ships, increasingly tangled with each other in the confined channel, lost the ability to maneuver effectively. The Phoenician contingent on the Persian right, opposite the Athenians, fought back with the skill and aggression that made them the most respected sailors in the ancient Mediterranean. They were not broken easily. The fighting on the left wing of the Greek line, where the Athenians met the Phoenicians, was the most intense and prolonged engagement of the battle. Individual ship actions at close range, ramming and counter-ramming, ships locking together, and marine combat breaking out on the decks, while the oarsmen below tried to back water and disengage. The Athenian triremes had one advantage even over the Phoenicians in this environment. Their crews had been training intensively for this specific kind of close-quarters channel fighting, and their captains had 3 days of Artemisium combat experience, telling them exactly how to handle a Phoenician vessel in confined water. The Phoenicians were better sailors in the abstract. The Athenians were better prepared for this battle, in this channel, on this morning. On the Persian left, opposite the Peloponnesian Greek contingents, the Ionian Greek ships serving in the Persian fleet performed with the ambiguity that Themistocles had correctly predicted. Some fought, others did not fight hard. Some may have deliberately manoeuvred badly, as Themistocles' Artemisium inscription had invited them to do. The Samian contingent, according to some ancient accounts, turned and fled early in the engagement. The precise behaviour of each Ionian contingent is difficult to reconstruct from the sources, but the aggregate effect is clear. The Persian left did not perform at the level the Phoenician right did, and the Peloponnesian contingents opposing them made progress that the Athenians, fighting the better Phoenicians, initially could not match. In the centre and on the flanks, the compression problem that the channel geography had imposed on the Persian fleet was becoming catastrophic. Ships in the rear of the Persian formation, unable to see the battle clearly and receiving no coherent signals from the front, kept rowing forward, pushing into the ships ahead of them, fouling oars, breaking steering mechanisms, driving damaged ships further into the melee rather than allowing them to withdraw. Persian captains trying to turn and withdraw from a lost engagement found the channel behind them blocked by their own fleet pressing forward. A ship with a rammed hull taking water could not move laterally to get clear. There was no lateral space, and simply sat in the channel, sinking, while other ships rowed around or into it. The Persian formation, which had entered the strait as an organised battle fleet, was progressively dissolving into a congested mass of individual ships, some fighting, some sinking, some trying to back water, some trying to advance, none of them able to coordinate effectively because the command structure had no way to communicate across a channel full of noise, smoke and dying ships. Xerxes, watching from his throne on the promontory above the strait, could see the Persian formation losing coherence in real time. He had his secretaries beside him, prepared to record the names of commanders who distinguished themselves. What they recorded instead was a catalogue of failure, ship after ship going down, the Persian line bending and breaking, commanders who had been confidently advancing an hour before, now trying desperately to extract their vessels from a battle that was turning against them faster than anyone on the Persian side had considered possible. One story preserved in ancient sources, its precise historical accuracy uncertain, but its symbolic resonance undeniable, has Xerxes watching a Phoenician captain arrive at the shore, having lost his ship, and begin making excuses for his failure. Persian soldiers standing near the king reportedly cut the man's head off before he finished speaking. Whether or not that specific incident happened, it captures something true about the atmosphere on the Persian command promontory as the battle progressed. Artemisia of Halicarnassus, the same queen who had warned Xerxes not to fight in these waters, now distinguished herself during the battle in a way that Herodotus records with barely concealed admiration. Pressed by an Athenian trireme and unable to escape into open water, she rammed and sank a vessel in her path, which happened to be an allied ship from Calindus, a Persian allied state whose king was aboard. Killing your own ally's king in a naval engagement is generally not considered good tactical practice, but the effect, from Artemisia's perspective, was unexpectedly beneficial. The Athenian captain pursuing her, seeing a Persian-marked ship ramming another ship, assumed Artemisia had either defected or was attacking a Greek vessel, and broke off the pursuit to engage other targets. Artemisia escaped. Xerxes, watching from the promontory and seeing one of his ships going down, reportedly asked who had sunk it and was told it was Artemisia. He is supposed to have said that his men had become women and his women men. Whether the exchange is precisely as reported, it tells you something about the state of the battle at that point. The Persian king reduced to looking for individual bright spots in a general disaster. There was also a sound before the first collision that mattered almost as much as the collision itself. The Greek ships began singing the paean, the battle hymn that turned fear into rhythm and rhythm into rowing discipline. Aeschylus, who fought in the battle and later turned the Persian defeat into tragedy on an Athenian stage, remembered the Greek cry not as panic but as command, men calling on one another to free their homeland, their children, their wives, the temples of their gods and the graves of their ancestors. The exact words come to us through poetry, but the function was practical. In a trireme battle, sound organises bodies. 170 oarsmen cannot see the battle. Most of them sit low in the hull, facing backward, hearing orders through the coxswain and feeling the ship's motion through the bench beneath them. The paean steadied the stroke. It made the fleet feel like one body. And when the Persian crews heard that sound coming across the morning water, they understood something important before the bronze rams touched them. The Greeks were not trapped animals. They were a fleet advancing with purpose. That matters because trireme combat was a discipline of seconds. A captain had to judge angle, speed, current, distance, the enemy's oar rhythm, the opening between two hulls, and the moment when his own ram would strike cleanly enough to damage the enemy without trapping his ship in the wreckage. A bad ram could lock two vessels together and turn a naval maneuver into a boarding fight. A perfect ram punched through the enemy's side then required immediate backing water so the attacking ship could pull free before the damaged hull dragged it down or exposed it to a counterstrike. Every oarsman had to reverse on command. Every marine had to stay low until boarding was ordered. Every helmsman had to keep the ship aligned under conditions in which one fouled oarbank could cripple the entire vessel. This is why Themistocles' choice of crews and water mattered. Salamis was not won because Greeks were magically braver than Persians. It was won because Greek ships were operating inside a tactical problem they had practiced for, while the Persian fleet was forced into a problem its size made worse. The Persian command structure magnified that problem. Xerxes' navy was magnificent in scale, but it was an imperial coalition. Phoenicians, Egyptians, Cypriots, Cilicians, Carians, Ionians, and others, each with their own officers, local signals, habits, rivalries, and levels of commitment to the campaign. In open water, that diversity was not necessarily fatal. Each contingent could operate in its own squadron, follow its own commander, and use space to recover from confusion. In the Salamis Strait, the squadrons compressed into one another. A Phoenician captain could not easily understand what an Egyptian squadron behind him intended. An Ionian ship hesitating on the left created pressure on the centre. A damaged Cilician vessel drifting across a narrow lane could block ships from three other contingents that had no common chain of command in the immediate moment. The Greeks had their own coalition problems, but in the battle line itself their task was simpler. Hold, strike, back water, strike again. The Persians had to coordinate an empire in a corridor. This is why the first phase of the battle was decisive even before the full casualty count emerged. Once the Persian front ranks lost room to manoeuvre, the rear ranks became weight rather than support. They pushed the damaged ships forward when those ships needed space to withdraw. They blocked the escape of captains who realised too late that the channel was a trap. They prevented the Phoenicians from using the open water excellence that made them so dangerous. The better the Persian fleet tried to commit itself, the worse the congestion became. A cautious Persian commander might have backed out, reorganised, and refused to fight in the channel. But Xerxes was watching from the throne above the water, and every captain below knew it. To retreat too early under the eyes of the king was to invite suspicion, disgrace, or worse. So they kept rowing into the pressure. They kept feeding ships into the narrow water. They kept trying to win the battle Xerxes wanted, while Themistocles quietly received the battle he had designed. The Athenians paid for that design in the hardest sector of the line. Facing the Phoenicians meant facing the one part of the Persian fleet that could plausibly match them, stroke for stroke and decision for decision. The Phoenicians were not fools. They were not helpless victims of geography. They fought with real skill, and for a time the Athenian left was under severe pressure. Ships collided so closely that captains had no room for elegant manoeuvre and had to choose between ramming, boarding, or simply shoving the enemy hull aside to create space for the next strike. But the Athenians had the emotional force of Athens behind them. Their families were on Salamis. Their city was ash across the water. Their defeat would not mean the loss of a campaign alone. It would mean the permanent loss of the life they had evacuated to save. That does not make men invincible. It does make them very difficult to move. On the other side of the battlefield, the Aeginetans deserve more credit than they usually receive. Athens produced the great strategist and the largest fleet, so Athens dominates the memory of Salamis. But the Aeginetan squadron at the exit of the strait turned Persian retreat into disaster. A ship fleeing a lost battle is not automatically destroyed. If it can reach open water, it can regroup, sail home, and fight another day. The Aeginetans made that impossible for many Persian vessels. As the Persian line began to break and ships tried to stream out of the southern mouth of the channel, the Aeginetans struck them while they were disordered, damaged, and trying to escape rather than fight. It was not the glamorous part of the battle. It was the practical part. The trap only works if the door stays closed. The battle lasted through the morning and into the early afternoon. Its duration and the specific sequence of its phases are impossible to reconstruct with precision from the ancient sources, which give us vivid detail in some places and frustrating vagueness in others. What is clear is the shape of the outcome. The Persian fleet, unable to deploy its numbers effectively in the confined channel, unable to execute the flanking maneuvers that were its primary tactical instrument, progressively disordered by its own size in the narrow water, and outfought by Greek crews who had been prepared for exactly this engagement, broke. Not all at once, not in a single moment of collapse. But progressively, section by section, the Persian line came apart, ships withdrawing, some in good order, many in panic, some simply sinking where they had been rammed and left. The Phoenician contingent, the best Persian force in the battle, suffered the worst losses precisely because they fought the hardest and stayed engaged the longest. The Ionians withdrew earlier, which may have saved more of their ships, but left the Phoenicians increasingly isolated in the fighting. By the time the sun was declining toward the western horizon, the Persian fleet was in retreat out of the strait, and the Greek fleet held the channel. Ancient sources give wildly varying casualty figures. As always with ancient battle accounts, the precise numbers are essentially unverifiable. What is certain is that Persian losses were severe, and Greek losses were manageable. Herodotus claims the Greeks lost 40 ships. The Persians lost far more. Some ancient sources say 200, others more. The specific figure is less important than the strategic consequence. The Persian fleet had been broken as an offensive instrument. One critical part of Salamis was happening just outside the main line of sight. On the small island of Plataea, near the entrance to the strait, Xerxes had stationed a picked Persian force to rescue survivors from wrecked Persian ships and to finish off any Greeks who washed ashore. Aristides led Athenian hoplites across to the island, while the main battle still raged. They landed, formed, and overwhelmed the Persian detachment. The island was cleared, and the Greeks removed one more piece of Xerxes' plan from the board. It was a small action compared with the storm of ships in the channel, but it mattered. Even the escape routes and recovery points Xerxes had prepared were being taken from him. At the southern exit, the Aeginetan ships performed the same role on water. Any Persian vessel that tried to break out of the channel in disorder found another Greek squadron waiting for it. Salamis was not just a wall in front of the Persian fleet, it was a trap with teeth at the exit. The Persians had rowed in expecting to close a net around the Greeks. By afternoon, they were discovering that the net had closed around themselves. After Salamis, the fleet could no longer sustain the supply and operational support that Xerxes' land army required for a continued campaign deep into Greece. On the promontory above the strait, Xerxes understood what he had watched. His secretaries had nothing useful to record. The fleet he'd brought from Asia, the armada that had carried the full weight of Persian maritime power across the Aegean, had been defeated by an enemy less than half its size in a channel barely a mile wide. The King of Kings sat on his golden throne above the water and watched the wreckage of his fleet drifting in the strait below him, and the stories that have come down to us suggest that what he felt in that moment was not the measured strategic calculation of a great king reassessing his campaign. It was something raw and less dignified than that. something closer to the feeling of a man who had flogged the Hellespont for destroying his bridge, and received, from the sea, a punishment exactly proportionate to the arrogance of that gesture. The Persian land army was still intact. Xerxes still had hundreds of thousands of soldiers in Greece, still had Mardonius and the elite Persian infantry, still had the capacity to contest the Greek peninsula by land. The war was not over, but the strategic situation had changed in a way that was permanent and irreversible. Without the fleet to supply and support a prolonged campaign, Xerxes could not winter in central Greece with his full army. He would have to withdraw a substantial portion of his force back to Asia, back across the Hellespont, back to the supply lines that the fleet could no longer guarantee in hostile Aegean waters. He could leave Mardonius with a selected force, the best units, the most capable soldiers, to complete the conquest the following year. But Xerxes himself was going home. The king who had flogged the sea was retreating across it. The Greeks watched the Persian fleet withdraw from the strait and understood, with a clarity that needed no strategic analysis, what had happened. Men who had spent the morning killing Persians in the confined channel now sat on their rowing benches in the sudden, relative quiet of the aftermath, and listened to the sounds of Salamis without the overlay of battle, the water against the hull, the creak of oar leather in the oar ports, the distant sounds of injured men, the crying from the island shore where the Athenian evacuees had been watching. Some of those men on the shore were already making their way to the water's edge. The fleet was coming back to them. The battle was over. The city behind them was still burning, but the enemy fleet that would have made the burning permanent was broken and withdrawing. Themistocles had argued for pursuing the Persian fleet immediately, pressing the advantage while the withdrawal was still disordered, following the retreating Persian ships out of the strait and destroying as many as possible before they could reorganize. He had a further plan that was audacious even by his standards: sail north at speed to the Hellespont, destroy the pontoon bridges before Xerxes could use them to withdraw his army to Asia, trap the Persian land force in Europe without a line of retreat, strand the largest army in the ancient world in a country that could not feed it, with a navy that could no longer supply it, with autumn coming and the passes north through Thrace controlled by Greek-aligned forces. The plan was coherent. If it had worked, the Persian wars might have ended at the Hellespont in the autumn of 480 BC with the destruction of Xerxes' entire expeditionary force. The Peloponnesian commanders refused. Eurybiades refused. The Allied Council, by majority decision, declined to pursue. Themistocles accepted the decision publicly, and then, in a move that is pure Themistocles, that reveals the particular quality of his intelligence as clearly as anything else in his career, sent another secret message to Xerxes. This time, the message told the king that it was Themistocles personally who had prevented the Greek fleet from pursuing and destroying the Hellespont bridges, that Themistocles was a friend to Persia, that Xerxes should remember this service when the time came. Whether Themistocles intended this as a genuine insurance policy against a future Persian victory, or as a piece of misdirection designed to encourage Xerxes to withdraw faster, by reassuring him the route home was safe, or simply as the act of a man who understood that powerful enemies are best managed through the maintenance of multiple options simultaneously. Scholars have argued about his motivations for 2,500 years without reaching a consensus. What it tells you is that Themistocles, even at the moment of his greatest triumph, was already thinking about what came next. Xerxes withdrew. He marched his army north through Boeotia and Thessaly at speed, outpacing the autumn rains and the Greek fleet's ability to threaten his coastal supply lines. He left Mardonius in Thessaly with roughly 300,000 of the best soldiers in the Persian army, the elite infantry, the best cavalry, the units that had not been broken at Artemisium or Salamis, with orders to complete the conquest of Greece the following spring. Then he crossed the Hellespont back to Asia and never returned to Greece. The King of Kings, who had bridged a sea and flogged it into submission, went home. Behind him, in the strait between Salamis and the smoking ruins of Athens, the Greek fleet held the water. Right, we need to pause for just a second here, because if you are the kind of person who watches 3-hour documentaries about ancient naval battles, I'm almost certain you're also the kind of person who would genuinely love wearing a piece of that history. We have just launched our brand new Wars in History merchandise shop, and I want to walk you through what's in there right now, because this stuff is seriously good. We've got the Battle of Salamis tee. If you just watched this act and felt that, you know exactly why that design exists. The Phalanx Wall collection is there in multiple versions, including a premium print that honestly looks incredible. For the Thermopylae faithful, the Molenlebe teas, come and take them, are available in both standard and premium versions, and if you want something that captures the spirit of the 10,000, the Anabasis tea is there too. The full link is pinned in the description and comments. Every purchase directly funds the research, the production, and the sheer volume of ancient sources I have to get through to make episodes like this one. Go grab something you'll actually wear. The shop link is right below. Now, back to the war, because Salamis was not the end, not even close. Winter in Boeotia is cold and grey and very quiet. And through the winter of 480 to 479 BC, the Persian general Mardonius used that quiet with the patience and precision of a man who understood that time, properly managed, was itself a weapon. He had pulled the surviving Persian land force northward out of Attica after Salamis, not in panic, not in rout, but in the careful, deliberate withdrawal of a commander who recognized that a campaign whose naval component had been destroyed required strategic reassessment before it could be resumed. Mardonius took the best units available to him, the elite Persian infantry, the Immortals, or their reconstituted equivalent, the finest cavalry in the army, the Bactrian and Saca horsemen whose ability to suppress and harass enemy formations on open ground had been the primary tactical instrument of the Persian land campaign since the crossing of the Hellespont. Northward into the Boeotian and Thessalian plains, where the terrain was favourable for cavalry, the local population was largely collaborationist, and the supply situation was manageable without the coastal fleet that Salamis had destroyed as an operational instrument. He put distance between his force and the Greek fleet. He rested his men through the cold months. He resupplied. He rebuilt his cavalry's effectiveness after the strains of the Attica campaign. And he spent the political capital of Persian diplomatic pressure on the one strategic objective that, if achieved, would make everything else unnecessary. He spent the winter trying to buy Athens. The approach was architecturally careful. Mardonius used Alexander I of Macedon as his intermediary, a man in a genuinely complicated position, technically a Persian vassal whose kingdom had submitted to Xerxes during the advance south, but who had maintained back-channel communications with the Greek alliance throughout the campaign, and whose role as a go-between suited both sides in the negotiation Mardonius was proposing. Alexander travelled to Athens with an offer that was, on its own terms, generous. Persian friendship, full Athenian autonomy. Athens would govern itself, maintain its democracy, conduct its own affairs without Persian interference. Reconstruction, at Persian expense, of everything that had been burned. The temples, the public buildings, the walls, all of it rebuilt from the treasury of the empire that had destroyed them. Territory, if Athens wanted expansion. All Xerxes required in return was Athenian neutrality. Athens stepping out of the Hellenic League. Athens removing its fleet from the Allied order of battle. Athens leaving the Peloponnesian states to face the Persian land army alone, without the maritime power that had made resistance viable. The strategic logic was as clean as a blade. Athens had provided more than half the ships at Salamis. Without the Athenian fleet, the Greek naval capacity dropped below the threshold at which it could realistically contest Persian operational freedom in the Aegean. Without naval freedom in the Aegean, the Peloponnesian states could not be supplied or reinforced by sea. The wall at the Isthmus of Corinth, that last land barrier behind which Spartan strategy had always ultimately sheltered, became strategically irrelevant if Persian ships could simply sail around it and land troops anywhere on the Peloponnesian coast. Athens accepting Mardonius's offer did not just remove Athens from the war, it ended the war. Persia won by diplomacy what it had failed to win at Salamis, and the Greek alliance dissolved without another battle being fought. If Athens accepted, everything that had happened at Thermopylae, Artemisium and Salamis became a delay rather than a turning point. 300 Spartans dead in a mountain pass, for nothing. The Athenian fleet built from Laurian silver, for nothing. The entire civilian population of Athens evacuated and watching their city burn from a refugee island, for nothing. Mardonius's offer was not just a diplomatic gesture, it was a weapon of strategic annihilation aimed directly at the meaning of everything the Greeks had done since Xerxes crossed the Hellespont. The Athenians refused, unanimously, publicly, and in terms that Herodotus preserves with a quiet pride that comes through even across 2,500 years of transmission, they told Alexander to carry back to Mardonius that as long as the sun continued on its present course, as long as the physical world operated according to its observable natural laws, Athens would never make peace with the men who had burned the temples of its gods and the tombs of its ancestors. They cited the burning of the Acropolis explicitly. They cited the desecration of sacred places. They cited the bones of their dead in the ground below the city the Persians had destroyed. And then they turned to the Spartan envoys who had been watching the exchange with the carefully concealed anxiety of men who knew exactly what an Athenian acceptance of that offer would mean for the Peloponnese, and they reminded them, pointedly and without diplomatic softening, that the Peloponnesian army needed to march north before Mardonius decided to move into Attica again, because Athens was not going to conduct another civilian evacuation, was not going to watch its rebuilt city burned a second time without knowing that Sparta was coming with an army capable of fighting the battle that settled the matter permanently. This exchange, the Athenian rejection of Mardonius's offer and the simultaneous pressure applied to Sparta to march, is one of the most consequential diplomatic moments of the entire Persian Wars, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives in the standard narrative. Athens had options in the winter of 479 BC, genuine options, not theoretical ones. The offer from Mardonius was real, and it was good. An Athens that accepted it would have been safer, wealthier, and physically intact rather than a smoking ruin. The men who voted to refuse it were voting for continued war, continued sacrifice, continued risk of the total destruction that Salamis had only temporarily averted. They refused because of the burned temples, because of the ancestor graves, because of what it would mean to themselves, to their children, to the idea of what Athens was, to make peace with the army that had done those things. That refusal, driven by grief and rage and a sense of collective identity that valued honour above survival, was the decision that made Plataea possible. Sparta hesitated. This is the part of the story that the standard historical narrative tends to handle quickly and uncomfortably, because Spartan hesitation in the spring of 479 BC is not compatible with the heroic image of Sparta that Thermopylae had created. But it happened, and it nearly unravelled everything Salamis had saved. The Peloponnesian strategy, at its core, was defensive. Behind the wall being built across the isthmus, Spartan territory was theoretically secure. The narrow neck of the Peloponnese was defensible terrain where Persian cavalry could not operate freely. The Ephors, the 5 elected magistrates who controlled Spartan policy, were reluctant to commit a large Spartan army to a campaign in Boeotia, when the home front felt, however misleadingly, protected. They delayed. They sent diplomatic responses that promised action without specifying when. They continued building the isthmus wall while letting their allies absorb the pressure of Mardonius's spring campaign. Mardonius, receiving Athens' refusal, marched south again. His army crossed into Attica in the early summer of 479 BC and reoccupied the abandoned city for the second time in less than a year. He sent another offer to the Athenians, who had evacuated to Salamis again, watching Persian cavalry ride back through the streets of a city that had barely begun to recover from the first burning. The Athenian assembly, now operating at a level of fury that had moved well past the point where diplomatic language was useful, sent envoys to Sparta with a message of extraordinary bluntness. If Sparta did not march its army north immediately, Athens would be forced to accept whatever terms Persia offered. The envoys delivered this ultimatum before the Spartan assembly, and the Spartans, who had been quietly building their wall while their allies did the fighting and dying, heard in it exactly the threat they had been managing around since Salamis. The Athenian fleet, changing sides. The isthmus wall, irrelevant. The entire defensive structure of the Peloponnesian position, gone overnight. The Spartan regent Pausanias was given command. The army that marched north from Sparta was the largest force Sparta had sent outside the Peloponnese in living memory. 5,000 full Spartiates, the armoured warrior citizens who were the hardest infantry in the ancient world, accompanied by 5,000 peroikoi, and a vast support contingent of helot attendants, perhaps 7 to 10 per Spartiate, who carried equipment, prepared food, and performed the logistical functions that freed the warriors to focus entirely on fighting. The Peloponnesian allied contingents fell in behind the Spartan corps. Tegea, Corinth, Sicyon, Megara, Phlius, and the other cities of the southern Greek world, bringing the total heavy infantry count to somewhere around 38,000 hoplites. The Athenians added 8,000 of their own under Aristides, the same man who had brought the intelligence about the Persian encirclement to the Allied council at Salamis, now commanding the Athenian land contribution to the battle that would decide whether Salamis had meant anything permanent. Other allied Greek states contributed additional contingents. The full coalition force at Plataea, counting lightly armed troops and support personnel, may have been the largest Greek army ever assembled on a single field, perhaps 100,000 men in total, marching north to fight the best of what remained of Xerxes' invasion force. Mardonius had approximately 120,000 men by the most credible modern estimates, drawn from the finest units in the Persian military establishment. His Greek allies, primarily the Theban Boeotians, whose collaboration with Persia had been enthusiastic and total throughout the campaign, and who were now committed beyond any possibility of retreat, contributed additional thousands of hoplites to the Persian order of battle. He chose his ground with the careful eye of a commander who had been planning this engagement through a winter of preparation. The fortified camp he established on the Boeotian plain near the Asopus River, between the city of Plataea to the south and the river to the north, was positioned to maximize the effectiveness of his primary tactical instrument, cavalry, while providing the fortified enclosure as a fallback defensive position if the battle went wrong. He was not planning to simply receive a Greek assault on ground of the Greek choosing. He was planning to use his cavalry's mobility to suppress and starve the Greek coalition until it either attacked him on terrain that favoured Persian tactics or fell apart from internal political pressure and logistical failure. It was the same patient, systematic approach that had served Persian strategy throughout the campaign, and for 11 days it nearly worked again. The Greek army took up its position on the ridgeline of Mount Cithaeron, above the Asopus plain, where the broken terrain limited the effectiveness of Persian cavalry. It was a strong defensive position against cavalry. The slopes were too steep and rocky for effective horseback operations, and the rocky outcroppings provided natural cover for infantry against missile fire from below. But it was also, as Mardonius recognised from the moment the Greeks arrived and chose not to descend onto the plain, an unsustainable position. The ridge had limited access to water. The supply routes coming north through the Cithaeron passes from the Greek rear were vulnerable to cavalry raids on the open approaches below the ridge. Holding a coalition army of 70,000 fighting men and tens of thousands of support personnel in a static position, thirsty and increasingly short of food, while the enemy moved freely across the open terrain below. That was not a situation that could continue indefinitely, and Mardonius understood it with perfect clarity. He did not need to attack the ridge. He needed to make the ridge unlivable. Persian cavalry under Mecistius began working the Greek position almost immediately. Not in massed frontal assaults against the ridge. Mardonius was not going to send his horsemen into the teeth of a Greek phalanx on elevated, broken ground. Instead, the cavalry worked systematically at every vulnerable point in the Greek position, probing attacks against the Megarian contingent, whose location on the left of the Greek line sat on somewhat more exposed ground than the rest of the ridge and offered less natural protection against cavalry harassment. Raids against the supply convoys trying to move provisions and water north through the Cithaeron passes, horsemen appearing out of the dust on the approaches to the passes, scattering the wagon guards, overturning the wagons, killing the animals, burning the supplies before the Greek infantry on the ridge could descend quickly enough to intervene. The gradual methodical tightening of a logistical noose around a position that had more vulnerable points than its commanders could simultaneously cover. The first significant Greek success against the Persian cavalry pressure came with the death of Mecistius, and the circumstances of his death tell you something important about both the effectiveness of the Persian cavalry tactics and their inherent vulnerability when they pressed too close. Mecistius was the senior Persian cavalry commander, a figure of genuine prestige and authority within the Persian army, whose personal courage and tactical skill had made him one of the most respected officers in the campaign. During one of the probing attacks against the Megarian position, Mecistius rode too close to the Greek line. An arrow, possibly fired by Athenian archers who had moved up to support the Megarian sector under pressure, struck his horse. The animal reared violently and threw him. He was in full Persian scale armour, which was excellent protection against most weapons at range, but he was on the ground, isolated from his cavalry, and Greek soldiers swarmed him before he could remount. Several blows glanced off his armour without finding a gap. The press of Greek bodies around him grew tighter. One soldier, the sources disagree on the precise method, found a gap beneath the scale plates and drove a weapon through it. Mecistius died in the dust in front of the Greek line. The reaction on both sides was immediate and disproportionate to the death of a single officer, which tells you how much weight his presence had carried in the Persian cavalry's operational confidence. The Persian horsemen pulled back visibly, the forward pressure on the Megarian sector easing as shock spread through the cavalry formation. On the Greek side, the response was almost celebratory. Shields clashing against spear shafts, voices raised along the ridge in something between a battle cry and a cheer, the body of Mecistius dragged along the Greek position for every allied soldier to see. For thousands of anxious men who'd been absorbing cavalry pressure for days without being able to respond effectively, the proof that the horsemen could be killed and that one of their most capable commanders was dead on Greek ground was worth more than its tactical significance suggested. But Mardonius's strategy did not require Mecistius to live. It required the Greek position to die. And the process of making it uninhabitable continued regardless. The Gargaphia Spring, primary water source for the Greek position on the ridge, was seized by Persian horsemen who rode in during a gap in the Greek defensive coverage, let their animals trample the basin into churned mud and fouled water, and posted archers at the approaches to prevent the Greeks from reclaiming it. The decision to target the water supply was the most surgically effective single action of the 11-day campaign. An army without water does not continue to function. Men can fight hungry. Soldiers have been fighting hungry since warfare began. But they cannot fight thirsty, not in August in Boeotia, not after days of tension and heat, and the physical demands of maintaining constant defensive readiness against cavalry attacks. The loss of Gargaphia made the Greek position on the ridge not just uncomfortable, but operationally impossible. Something had to change. Pausanias called his commanders together in the night. The tent held the command structure of the largest Greek coalition army ever assembled, and the atmosphere was the atmosphere of exhausted, thirsty men who had held as long as holding was physically possible. Every commander present understood the arithmetic. The army could not stay. The question was where to go and how to move without the movement becoming a catastrophe. Pausanias pointed to a position south of the Asopus, near the town of Plataea itself, closer to water sources, still on ground that limited cavalry effectiveness, accessible without crossing the open plain that Mardonius's cavalry controlled. The army would withdraw there in the night, before Persian cavalry could react to the movement and intercept the columns in the open. The decision was correct. The execution became one of the most consequential command breakdowns in the campaign, not because it led to defeat, but because it almost did, and because the chaos of the night withdrawal is what forced the decisive engagement at Plataea on terms that neither Pausanias nor Mardonius had fully planned for. A night withdrawal with 100,000 men from a dozen city-states, moving across unfamiliar terrain in complete darkness without lights, maintaining formation and cohesion against the awareness that Persian cavalry was somewhere in the black below the ridge. It was always going to be difficult. It was worse than difficult. The centre of the Greek line, the contingents from Corinth, Megara, and the other mid-coalition states, marched too far south. Not to the regroup point near Plataea, but past it, all the way into the town itself, losing contact with both wings in the dark and dispersing through the streets and buildings of the city, rather than holding a compact military formation. The Athenians on the left received contradictory orders, different messengers arriving with different instructions, and stalled, their units frozen between moving and staying while officers argued in hushed voices beside the road, and the night advanced toward dawn. And on the Spartan right, the withdrawal froze completely because of Amompharetus. Amompharetus was a Spartan regimental commander, a man raised from age 7 in a system that had spent his entire life telling him that the defining virtue of a Spartan soldier was refusal to retreat from the enemy. When Pausanias rode to him and ordered the withdrawal, Amompharetus picked up a large stone with both hands and dropped it at the regent's feet. "This is my vote against retreat," he said. He was not being theatrical. He was not being insubordinate in any sense that he recognized as insubordinate. He was being exactly what the Agog had made him, a man for whom the concept of retreat from a position facing the enemy was morally incoherent, regardless of strategic justification, Pausanias argued. Aristides, arriving from the Athenian sector, joined the argument. Time passed. The rest of the army was dissolving into the darkness while the Spartan right stood frozen at the edge of the ridge because one commander could not accept that moving south was not the same as running away. Eventually Pausanias ordered the Spartan column to begin moving without a Montforitus, gambling that the sight of the entire formation leaving would override even the most rigid interpretation of Spartan military honour. The gamble worked, barely. Montforitus waited until the column was almost out of sight, then brought his unit after them in a controlled, deliberate march that communicated clearly that he was not retreating, merely choosing to occupy a different position. He followed. At the last possible moment, he followed. By the time dawn began to show above the Stheron range, the Greek army was scattered across miles of Boeotian plain in 3 disconnected fragments. The centre dispersed into Plataea. The Athenians stalled somewhere between the ridge and the river. The Spartan right moving separately across the plain in a column that had no contact with either of the other 2 wings. From the Persian camp, as the first scouts went out and found the ridge empty, the view across the plain looked exactly like what a pursuing cavalry force dreams of finding. An enemy army coming apart on the move, its units separated and out of mutual supporting distance, the gaps between them wide enough to exploit before any of them could regroup. Mardonius rode forward and saw it himself. He had waited 11 days, absorbing the loss of Mecistius, enduring the frustration of a static engagement that had not yet produced the decisive assault he was preparing for. And now, suddenly, the Greek position was dissolving on its own. The seers had warned against attack. Every morning for 11 days the sacrificial omens had counselled patience. One of his officers reminded him carefully. Mardonius looked at the empty ridge. He looked at the separated Greek columns. He looked at the growing gap between the Spartan right and the Athenian left. He gave the order. The cavalry went first, charging across the plain toward the Spartan column before it could reach defensible ground near Plataea. The Persian infantry followed in mass. Persians, Medes, Bactrians, thousands of men moving at speed across the open plain. The restraint of 11 days released all at once into a pursuit that every man in the Persian force had been waiting for since the Greeks first appeared on the ridge of Kithaeron. Mardonius rode with them. He was not a commander who directed from the rear. He went forward on his black horse, visible to his troops, close enough to the front that his presence could be felt in the fighting line. The Persian advance accelerated across the plain toward the separated Spartan column. Aristides, watching from the Athenian position, saw the cavalry charge and immediately sent his force moving right to reinforce the Spartans and ran directly into the Theban phalanx. The Boeotian confederates who had collaborated with Persia throughout the campaign, positioned precisely to prevent the Athenians from crossing to Spartan support. Thousands of pro-Persian Greek hoplites, fighting on their home ground, blocking the route between the 2 main Greek contingents. The battle split into 2 simultaneous engagements, Spartans and Tygians facing the full Persian infantry assault on the right, Athenians locked in brutal close combat against Thebans on the left. 2 separate battles, happening across half a mile of Boeotian plain, neither wing able to see the other through the dust, no messenger able to cross between them while the fighting raged. On the Spartan right, Persian archers deployed behind their wicker shield barricade and began pouring volleys into the Spartan and Tygian formation with the systematic patience of men who had been trained to suppress infantry from a distance until the infantry either charged forward or broke. Men went down in the Spartan line, others stepped forward to fill the gaps. The formation held its position, taking casualties, while Pausanias performed sacrifice after sacrifice at the rear of the column, and every reading came back unfavourable. Hold. The gods say, hold. More arrows, more men down. The Spartan line bled where it stood and did not charge. The Tygians, watching the arrows fall and the men die and the Persian line pressing closer, finally broke forward without orders, their discipline cracking not in retreat but in the opposite direction. Stepping out of the Greek line and advancing on the Persian position before the signal came, Pausanias performed one final sacrifice. The omens changed, the order came, the Spartan line stepped forward. It did not sprint, it did not scream, it walked. A controlled, disciplined, 8-rank deep wall of bronze and shields moving at the pace of the slowest man in the formation, because no gap was acceptable and no gap was permitted. Persian archers kept shooting until the range was so close that drawing a full bowstring became physically impossible in the press of men behind them. Then the distance ran out, and the Greek shields hit the Persian wicker barricade, and the wall came apart under the combined weight of 8 Spartan ranks, driving forward without stopping. Spears punched through the gaps. The first Persian rank ceased to exist as a functional fighting unit in the first seconds of contact. The Spartans kept pushing, step by step. No sprinting, no shouting, no disorder, just the inexorable, grinding forward pressure of the finest heavy infantry in the ancient world, doing the thing it had been built and trained and conditioned across an entire civilization to do. Mardonius died in the fighting. The precise moment and exact manner of his death are recorded differently in different ancient sources. Herodotus attributes it to a Spartan soldier named Aeamnestus. Other sources are less specific. What is clear is that he was close to the front when he was killed, on his black horse, directing the battle at the range where his troops could see him, and that his death, when it spread through the Persian formation, removed the structural element that had been holding the line together. Officers began issuing conflicting orders. Units near the centre stopped advancing and started looking backward toward the fortified camp. The sustained, organised Persian assault that had been driving Spartans and Tegeans backward began to slow, then stop, then reverse. At the same moment, across the plain, the Athenians broke through the Theban line, both Greek wings pushing forward simultaneously in separate battles, arriving at something that looked like victory at almost exactly the same time. The Persian centre folding toward the camp, the Thebans retreating northward toward their city, leaving behind their dead and their dignity and whatever remained of the justification they had told themselves for choosing the Persian side. The plain between the two, battles clearing of organised resistance, the dust settling slowly over bodies that had not yet been counted. The survivors ran for the fortified camp, thousands of men pouring through the entrances, officers trying desperately to reorganise units behind the wooden walls and wagon barricades. For a while the defences held, the Spartans reaching the perimeter first and finding it too well constructed for direct assault. Archers and soldiers behind the walls pouring missiles into Greek troops trying to force their way through. Then the Tegeans found a weak point and broke through, the fighting spilling inside the enclosure. When the Athenians arrived at a second section of the perimeter and forced another breach, the camp became a killing ground. Thousands of men trapped in an enclosed space with nowhere to move, no direction to retreat, 2 converging Greek forces closing from opposite sides. The slaughter inside the Persian camp was enormous by any measure ancient or modern. The Persian land campaign did not end with a ceremony. It ended in the wreckage of a fortified camp on a Boeotian plain, with tens of thousands of dead, from 3 continents lying in the dust of a battlefield that neither side had fully planned, and that both sides had stumbled into through a combination of strategic necessity, logistical failure, and the refusal of one Spartan regimental commander to move when ordered. Plataea was not a clean victory. It was a messy, complicated, nearly catastrophic near-disaster that happened to produce the right outcome because the Spartans were what they were, and because Mardonius made the decision to pursue a fractured enemy instead of waiting for the omens to turn favourable. But its consequence was absolute and permanent. The largest Persian army remaining in Greece was destroyed. Mardonius was dead. The Persian wars, as a project of imperial conquest directed at mainland Greece, were over. With the camp captured, the Persian force that staggered north out of Boeotia after the battle, the survivors, those who had managed to escape before the Greek encirclement closed completely, was commanded by a Persian nobleman named Artabazus, who had advised against the battle, held his force back when he saw the Persian position collapsing, and led roughly 40,000 men on a forced march northward through Thessaly and Thrace, and all the way to the Hellespont without stopping. He crossed back to Asia and told Xerxes what had happened in Boeotia. He was one of the few Persian officers of the campaign to survive it with his judgment intact and his career unbroken. Behind him, on the plain below Plataea, the Greek alliance stood in the wreckage of the camp and looked at what they had done. Aristides supervised the distribution of the captured treasures with the scrupulous fairness that had earned him his reputation, organising the enormous wealth accumulated in the Persian camp, the gold and silver and the elaborate furnishings of a royal army that had expected to winter in a conquered country into a distribution among the allied states that was as equitable as the chaos of the aftermath allowed. Pausanias walked through the camp and reportedly stopped in front of Mardonius's royal tent, stared at the silk hangings and the silver furniture and the gold plate laid out for a dinner that would never be eaten, and told his servants to prepare a Spartan dinner beside it: black broth, barley bread, hard cheese, so that he could show the captured Persian servants the contrast between what Mardonius had brought to conquer Greece and what Greece had brought to defend it. Persia was not finished as a power, not even close. The Achaemenid Empire would continue for another century and a half, would remain the dominant political entity of the Near East and Central Asia, would war with Greece again in smaller conflicts and proxy engagements for decades. But the specific project that Xerxes had launched, the full conquest and absorption of mainland Greece into the Persian imperial system, was over, finished, permanently. Mardonius was in the ground, his army was destroyed, and the battle that had been meant to end Greek independence had instead ended the Persian invasion. The plain of Plataea was quiet again, the dust settling over the bodies of tens of thousands of men from 3 continents, from a dozen nations, in armour from Egypt and Bactria and Phocis and Sparta. The burial parties would come late, after the speeches were over and the banners had gone home. That is the brutal, unromantic truth of what a battlefield leaves behind. But somewhere north, across the Aegean, the war was still not completely done. One more act remained, and this one, uniquely among all the campaigns of the Persian Wars, would be fought not to defend Greece, but to destroy what remained of Persian power on the Greek world's doorstep. The Greeks were done surviving. Now they were going to make the empire bleed on its own soil. Before we move into the final chapter, I want to speak to you directly. A documentary like this takes serious research, writing, editing, maps, visuals, and a lot of time. If this channel gives you real value, the best way to support it is by joining the channel membership, grabbing something from the merch shop, or making a one-time contribution through Ko-fi or Patreon. Even the smallest support helps fund the next long-form epic and keeps these deep historical documentaries possible. All the links are pinned in the description and comments. Now, one battle remains, not in Greece, but on the shores of Asia Minor itself. The Greeks are going after what is left of the Persian fleet, and they are not coming to negotiate. There is a particular satisfaction in a story that ends on the enemy's soil. For 2 years, the Persian Empire had come to Greece. It had burned Athens. It had killed a Spartan king in a mountain pass. It had filled the Aegean with more warships than any force in the ancient world had ever assembled, and it had marched the largest land army in recorded history through the heart of the Greek world. Now, in the summer of 479 BC, with Mardonius dead on the plain of Plataea and the remnants of the Persian land force fleeing north through Thessaly, the Greeks turned around. They did not go home and celebrate. They did not dissolve the alliance and return to the comfortable, familiar business of arguing with each other. They crossed the Aegean, they went east, they took the war to Asia, and what they did there, on a rocky promontory on the Ionian coast, against the beached remnants of the fleet that had burned their city, was not just a military operation. It was a statement, a declaration, made in fire and bronze, about who now held the Aegean and what the cost of disputing that fact would be. The decision to go on the offensive was not automatic or strategically obvious in the immediate aftermath of Plataea. The rational case for stopping at the water's edge was real and articulable. Greece was free. The invasion was over. The alliance that had formed in desperate self-defense in 481 BC had accomplished the specific purpose for which it had been assembled. It had prevented the absorption of mainland Greece into the Persian imperial system. The city-states could go home, bury their dead, rebuild their walls, and return to the normal Greek condition of intermittent warfare with each other. The case for continuing to press the campaign across the Aegean into Persian-controlled territory was a case for sustained strategic commitment beyond immediate self-defense, and that kind of commitment is always harder to maintain in a coalition of independent states than the shared emergency that originally bound them together. But several factors made the offensive case compelling in ways that could not be easily dismissed. The Persian naval remnant, the ships that had survived Salamis and been withdrawn to the Aegean coast of Asia Minor, was still there. still intact as a force on paper, anchored or beached somewhere along the Ionian shore, representing a potential threat that would require indefinite vigilance to monitor as long as it existed. The Ionian Greek cities of the Asian coast, communities of Greek speakers who had been living under Persian rule since Cyrus the Great, absorbed them in the middle of the 6th century BC, whose own revolt against Persian control in 499 BC had been the original spark that lit the chain of events leading to Marathon and Thermopylae, were sending signals that the moment might be right for liberation. Samos, whose island sat directly opposite the Mycale promontory where the Persian fleet was based, had already opened communications with the Greek fleet. The Ionians were watching the smoke from Salamis and the news from Plataea and asking whether this time, unlike the disastrous Ionian revolt that had ended in the burning of Miletus 20 years before, the mainland Greeks might actually follow through on the promise of solidarity. The Greek fleet that assembled at Delos in the spring of 479 BC numbered around 110 triremes, smaller than what had fought at Salamis, but sailing against a Persian fleet whose operational confidence and numerical strength had both been severely reduced by 2 years of catastrophic losses. Joint command, as throughout the campaign, the Spartan king Leonidas holding overall naval command, the Athenian strategos Xanthippus commanding the Athenian contingent. Xanthippus is worth a specific introduction at this point, because he tends to be overshadowed in the historical narrative by the larger personalities of Themistocles and Aristides, but he was a commander of genuine ability whose decisions at Mycale and afterward would shape the direction of Greek strategy for the next generation. He was also the father of Pericles, which means that the man who commanded the Athenian fleet at the battle that ended the Persian Wars was the direct biological predecessor of the man who would preside over the golden age that those wars made possible. The Persian naval force had done something at Mycale that tells you everything you need to know about the state of Persian naval confidence after Salamis. It had beached itself. The Persian commanders, having made an honest operational assessment of their fleet's ability to fight the Greek fleet in open water, after the losses and the psychological damage of Salamis, had made the decision to drag their remaining warships onto the beach at the Mycale promontory, a rocky headland on the Ionian coast directly opposite Samos, at a site the ancient world called the Gaizon, build a timber and earthwork palisade around them, station their land forces inside the enclosure and wait. The ships had stopped being a fleet and started being a fort. The most powerful maritime empire in the ancient world had responded to the loss of Salamis by pulling its warships out of the water and turning them into defensive walls. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment, because it captures something essential about what Themistocles had achieved in the strait between Salamis and the Attic shore. He had not just defeated a fleet, he had broken an institution's belief in its own capability. The Persian ground force inside and around the Mycale enclosure was not negligible. A substantial contingent of Persian infantry, drawn from the same quality of troops that had fought at Plataea, the cream of the imperial military establishment, had been stationed to defend the beached fleet and the fortified position around it. The overall Persian commander at Mycale was Tigranes, a man of senior rank in the Persian military hierarchy, operating with the awareness that what happened at this promontory would be reported directly to Xerxes. The Persians also had a contingent of allied troops, Samians, Milesians, and other Ionians serving in the Persian military establishment, whose reliability under the specific circumstances of a Greek attack on a Mycale beach was a question that the Persian commanders were already thinking about carefully before the Greek fleet appeared on the horizon. The Samians, meanwhile, had been working both sides of the strait with the practical intelligence of a small state that understood its own vulnerability perfectly. They had sent envoys to the Greek fleet at Delos urging the Greeks to sail east, promising that the sight of a Greek fleet in Ionian waters would trigger exactly the kind of general uprising among the Ionian Greek communities that the Persian garrison commanders feared. The Samians knew their neighbours. They knew the Greek communities of the Ionian coast had been watching Salamis and Plataea with an intensity born of 2 decades of Persian rule that had included the brutal suppression of the Ionian revolt, the burning of Miletus in 494 BC, and the mass deportation of Milesian survivors to the Persian interior. The wound of the failed revolt was still raw in Ionian Greek memory. The question was not whether Ionian Greeks wanted liberation. It was whether they believed, this time, that the mainland Greeks would not abandon them again as they had 20 years before. Leonidas sailed east. the fleet crossed the Aegean and reached Samos to find the Persian garrison already gone. It had withdrawn to the mainland, to the fortified enclosure at Mycale, consolidating behind the palisade rather than defending Samos against a Greek fleet it could not fight at sea. The Greeks sailed after them. When the fleet appeared off the Mycale headland, Leonidas ordered his ships manoeuvred close enough to shore that his herald could shout a message to the Ionian Greek soldiers serving inside the Persian camp. The message told them the Greeks had come to liberate Ionia. It told them to remember their kinship with the people now standing off their coast. It told them to fight for their freedom when the battle started, or at least to stand aside and let it happen. The message was delivered in Greek, loud enough for the Ionian soldiers to hear, and also, deliberately, loud enough for the Persian officers commanding them to hear as well, planting the seed of distrust between the Persian command and its Greek-speaking troops at the precise moment when that distrust would be most operationally damaging. The Persian response to that threat was swift and reveals the exact nature of the problem Leonidas had just created. The Persian commanders began disarming the Samian troops inside the enclosure before the Greek attack began, removing their weapons, reducing their ability to switch sides or create internal chaos if the battle went badly. They sent the Milesian contingent away from the camp entirely, dispatching them to guard the mountain passes behind the Mycale position, which removed their questionable loyalty from the immediate combat area. It was a reasonable precaution against betrayal. It was also, as events would prove, a catastrophically mistaken operational decision, because the Milesians, positioned in the mountain passes with their weapons and their own calculations about the battle's likely outcome, would later turn those passes into killing grounds for Persian soldiers trying to escape through them. The precaution solved the immediate problem of potential Ionian betrayal inside the camp. It positioned the potential betrayers perfectly to ensure that no Persian soldier who tried to flee would reach safety. The Greek landing was divided between the two wings. Xanthippus and the Athenians came ashore on the beach and began moving along the coastline toward the Persian palisade. A direct approach, along the flat ground between the sea and the lower slopes of the Mycale promontory. Leonidas and the Spartan contingent disembarked slightly further west and began moving through the hills, a longer, harder route through the inland terrain of the promontory that would bring them around to the landward side of the Persian position. The intention was to strike the camp from two directions simultaneously, hitting both the seaward face and the inland face at the same time, and preventing the Persian defenders from concentrating their strength against a single point of assault. It was exactly the kind of coordinated two-pronged attack that required timing and communication to execute properly. The two forces would be moving through different terrain, unable to see each other, needing to arrive at their respective assault positions at approximately the same moment without a reliable means of coordination. The Athenians came up first. The advance along the beach brought Xanthippus' force to the Persian palisade, while the Spartans were still working through the inland hills. There is a detail in Herodotus at this point in the narrative that I have always found extraordinary. One of those moments where the ancient sources deliver something so specific and so strange that it stays with you long after the tactical details have faded. As the Athenian advance approached the Persian enclosure, a herald's staff appeared on the beach ahead of them, a wand of the kind carried by official divine messengers. Herodotus records that the Greeks took this as a supernatural omen, as evidence that news of the victory at Plataea had arrived by divine transmission, that the gods themselves were confirming the outcome of both battles simultaneously. Whether the staff was a genuine coincidence, a piece of debris from some previous diplomatic contact on that stretch of coast, or a story constructed after the fact to give divine endorsement to the tradition that Plataea and Mycale were fought on the same day, it does not ultimately matter. What matters is that the Athenians charged without waiting for the Spartans. The initial assault on the palisade broke. Persian archers behind the wall maintained effective fire at close range as the Athenians tried to force the perimeter, and the first Greek rushes stalled under missile fire with casualties mounting in the space between the waterline and the wall. The geometry of an assault on a prepared defensive position is always brutal for the attacker. You are running toward the men who can see you coming, over open ground that provides no cover, under fire that begins the moment you leave whatever shelter you started from and does not stop until you either breach the wall or die in front of it. Greek hoplites were excellent fighting men in almost every tactical context. Storming a fortified position across a killing ground was the specific context that most disadvantaged their equipment and their training. Then the camp began to come apart from the inside. The Samian troops who had not been fully disarmed, and the process of disarming allied troops in a camp under imminent attack is not a clean or complete operation, began attacking the Persian troops sharing the enclosure with them. The timing of this internal attack, coinciding with the Athenian assault on the outer wall, created exactly the two-directional pressure that the Persian garrison had no prepared response for. Soldiers trying to hold the palisade against Greek assault from outside found themselves under attack from their own allied troops inside. Officers trying to maintain unit cohesion found their formations dissolving as the Samians and other Ionian Greeks who had been waiting for this moment acted on calculations they had been making since the Greek fleet appeared off the coast. The palisade broke. The precise mechanism, whether the Athenians forced a section of the wall through sustained assault, or whether the internal chaos created by the Samian attacks weakened the defence enough to make a section of the perimeter vulnerable, is not entirely clear from the sources. What Herodotus describes is the wall being forced and Greek troops pouring through into the enclosure, the fighting inside immediately dissolving into the close-range chaos that heavily armed Greek hoplites were built for, and that Persian archers operating behind a fixed defensive line were not. The distance that the wicker shields in the palisade had provided, the space that made Persian missile tactics effective, collapsed the moment Greek soldiers were inside the camp, and the battle transformed instantly from a siege into a melee in which every Persian advantage evaporated and every Greek advantage was maximised. The Spartans arrived from the inland hills to find the battle already decided in its broad strategic outlines. In the final phase of the assault, with Athenians pushing through the breached eastern face of the palisade and Spartans arriving at the inland approaches, the remaining Persian resistance crumbled from multiple directions simultaneously. The soldiers who tried to run for the mountain passes behind the camp found the Milesians waiting for them. Those same troops the Persian commanders had sent to guard the passes against Greek encirclement, who had spent the battle watching the fighting below and making their own assessment of which side was winning. The passes became killing grounds. The beach became killing ground. The enclosure itself became killing ground. Persian soldiers who had held the palisade with discipline and courage found themselves with no direction to move that did not lead directly into Greek weapons, and then the Greeks burned the ships. Every hull that had been dragged onto the beach and built into the palisade, every trireme that had survived the destruction of Salamis and made the long withdrawal to the Ionian coast, every vessel that represented what remained of the naval arm of Xerxes' invasion, soaked with whatever accelerant was available and put to the torch. The fires must have been visible across the strait to Samos, the smoke columns rising above the Mycale promontory in great black pillars, drifting east on the summer wind toward the Asian interior. The Persian fleet that had crossed the Hellespont in overwhelming force, that had swept through the Aegean carrying the full weight of imperial maritime power, ended as a burning wreckage on a beach, not in a last glorious naval engagement, not in a dramatic final stand at sea. Burning, unrecovered, gone. Ancient tradition held that Plataea and Mycale were fought on the same day, the same morning that Pausanias gave the order for the Spartan line to advance against Mardonius's infantry. On the Boeotian plain, Xanthippus was forcing the palisade on the Ionian shore. Herodotus records this coincidence with a mixture of wonder and careful qualification. He notes the tradition without fully endorsing it, the instincts of a good historian pulling against a story that feels almost too perfectly symmetrical to be accidental. Modern scholars treat the same-day tradition with appropriate skepticism, noting the logistical and chronological difficulties in aligning two battles fought on opposite sides of the Aegean with no reliable real-time communication between them. But the story was believed, and it was believed for a reason that had nothing to do with its literal accuracy. It was believed because it felt true, because the shape of the Persian Wars demanded an ending that matched the scale of what had come before. Two battles, two continents, the same morning, the land arm and the sea arm of the Persian invasion destroyed simultaneously. History arranging itself into the kind of narrative justice that human beings need from the events that define them. The consequences began immediately. The Greek communities of the western Anatolian coast had spent years watching Persian power from inside the empire's grip. Now they had seen Salamis, they had heard of Plataea, and at Mycale, They had watched the remaining Persian fleet burn on their own shore. The calculation changed in a single day. Samos, Chios, Lesbos and other island communities moved toward the Greek alliance, not as frightened spectators, but as partners in a war that had suddenly crossed from defence into liberation. That liberation produced the first major disagreement among the victors. The Spartan commander Leonidas wanted a clean solution: remove the Ionian Greeks from Asia Minor, settle them in mainland Greece and stop trying to defend cities on the far side of the Aegean. It was practical. It was also, from the Athenian point of view, unacceptable. Xanthippus refused. Athens would not abandon the Ionians after asking them to risk themselves against Persia. It would not hand the eastern Aegean back to the empire after Salamis had proved that control of those waters was the key to Greek survival. That refusal mattered. It pushed the war beyond one invasion and toward a permanent naval system in the Aegean. The island Greeks were admitted into the Hellenic League, and the meaning of the alliance changed. It was no longer just a mainland coalition trying to survive behind mountain passes and narrow straits. It now had commitments across the Aegean. Those commitments required ships, money, bases, crews, and year after year pressure against Persian positions. In other words, they required Athens. The future Delian League was already visible in that decision, even before anyone had given it a name. The fleet then sailed north toward the Hellespont, the same waterway Xerxes had bridged when he brought his army from Asia into Europe. By the time the Greeks arrived, the great pontoon bridges had already been broken up, probably by weather and Persian withdrawal. But fragments remained: cables, timbers, the wreckage of the structure that had once represented Xerxes' claim to master the sea itself. The Greeks cut apart what was left and treated the pieces as trophies. The road by which the King of Kings had entered Europe was gone. One Persian stronghold still remained on the European side: Sestos. Xanthippus besieged it through the autumn. When hunger finally forced the garrison to break, the Persian governor Artayctes was captured while trying to escape. Herodotus presents his punishment as deliberate symbolic justice, because Artayctes had violated a Greek hero shrine during the occupation. Xanthippus had him executed on the shore of the Hellespont, near the same waters where Xerxes had once watched his army cross. It was a brutal ending, but it was also a message. Persian authority in Europe was finished. The formal settlement would come much later. The Delian League, organised under Athenian leadership in 478 BC, carried the war forward across the Aegean. For decades, Greek fleets struck Persian positions, protected island allies, and pushed imperial power farther from the waters that had decided the invasion. The Peace of Callias, traditionally dated to 449 BC, later expressed in diplomatic language what Mycale had already announced in fire: the Aegean would not be treated as a Persian lake. That is why Mycale matters. It was not as famous as Thermopylae, not as dramatic as Salamis, not as terrifying as Plataea. But it was the moment the Greeks stopped merely surviving. They crossed the sea, broke what remained of the Persian fleet, brought the Ionian Greeks into the alliance, and cut the final visible cord between Xerxes' invasion and Europe. Thermopylae had bought time. Artemisium had taught the lesson. Salamis had shattered the fleet. Plataea had killed the army. Mycale made the victory irreversible. The ships are gone now. The beaches are quiet. The armies, kings, rowers, hoplites, archers, envoys, traitors, and commanders are dust. But the consequence remains. An empire came west with everything it had, and the Greek world not only survived it, it followed the empire back across the sea. What the Greeks won at Salamis, Plataea, and Mycale was not simply territory or security, or even freedom in the narrow political sense. What they won was time. Imperfect time. Violent time. Time filled with rivalry, pride, ambition, and future disaster. But enough time for something extraordinary to happen. Athens rebuilt on the ash-covered foundations of the temples Xerxes had burned. The Parthenon rose where the old sacred buildings had been destroyed. Pericles, son of Xanthippus, the commander at Mycale, became the leading figure of an age that produced some of the most influential architecture, drama, history, and political thought in the ancient world. Aeschylus had fought at Marathon. Herodotus wrote down the story. Sophocles and Euripides inherited the world that the Persian wars had preserved. None of that future was guaranteed when the Acropolis was burning and the fleet was trapped at Salamis. The victory also changed Athens itself. The men who rowed the triremes were citizens, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, poor men who had voted in the assembly and then pulled an oar in the battle that saved their city. After Salamis, Athenian democracy could point to the sea and say, "The people did this. The people chose the fleet. The people evacuated the city. The people fought and survived." That experience gave Athenian democracy a confidence no speech could have created on its own. But history does not let heroic alliances stay pure. Athens and Sparta saved Greece together, and then discovered they could not share the Greek world they had saved. Athens became a naval empire. Sparta remained a land power built on fear, discipline and control. Within 50 years of Salamis, they were at war with each other. The Peloponnesian War lasted 27 years and left both cities diminished. Persia, patient and rich, learned to use Greek rivalries the way the Greeks had once used Persian mistakes. Even then, the meaning of the Persian invasion did not disappear. The idea tested at Thermopylae, proven at Salamis, and secured at Plataea was simple and dangerous. Free communities, divided and flawed though they were, could refuse the command of the greatest empire on earth. They could stand in a pass, row into a strait, hold under arrows, and send the King of Kings home. The pass at Thermopylae still exists. The strait at Salamis still carries the same salt water. The plain below Plataea is quiet now. There are no armies there, no oars beating time, no bronze rams cutting through the morning water, just ground, just wind, just places where ordinary men once made decisions whose consequences outlived every empire involved. They decided it, we inherited it, and the least we can do is remember exactly how it was done, and that is the full story of how the Greeks annihilated the world's greatest invasion. If you made it to the end of a 3-hour documentary, I genuinely want to say thank you. That kind of commitment from you is what makes this channel worth building. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do it right now. The button is right there and it costs you nothing, and it means everything for getting this content in front of more people who would love it. Hit the like button if this video gave you what you came for. And right now, on the end screen, you'll find 2 videos I think you should watch next. They go deeper into specific battles and commanders that we touched on in this epic. Every one of those videos was built with the same level of research and the same commitment to telling history the way it actually was. Brutal, human, and true. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.